Adelia Gerard looked at the young man with tears in her eyes and asked in despair what he had just said. The young man asked her for forgiveness and said that Count Gerard was no longer alive, and Adelia angrily hit him in the face. She asked furiously how he dared to do this to her father. She screamed that thanks to him, he was free and alive. Servan asked her for forgiveness. She swung to hit him again, but he stopped her. Adelia screamed and demanded that he let her go. He asked for forgiveness. She screamed that it would have been better if her father had never helped him. Adelia screamed that it was all her fault. Servan said that it was not her fault, since it was he who beheaded him, and then handed over his body to his compatriots. She screamed that she loved her, but he insulted her homeland and trampled her heart. He froze as he could not utter a word. The young lady looked at him with fury and shouted that she would never love him again. He froze in place at her words, as he did not expect to hear something like that. He saw her running away. He wanted to stop her, but only managed to ask her for forgiveness. The young lady left, leaving him alone with himself, and Servan, in turn, was completely broken. I was very saddened because I couldn't tell her the terrible truth that her father was killed by his own compatriots. They killed him and put his head on a pike. They shouted that he was a traitor to the motherland. Elkarian Erlis is a strange prince, and her fiancé has given a terrible order. The young lady's father died because of a crime that the prince pinned on him. Adelia, without a doubt, believed her fiancé, since she considered him to be a close person to her. She was deprived of her freedom, but she still continued to trust her father and fiancé. Thus, a fatal misunderstanding arose between the young people. Many bitter days passed before she learned the truth. But this happened after he drank the potion. She screamed that she was mistaken about him and asked for forgiveness. He looked at her and said that he had a request for the horses. Adelia shouted that she would fulfill anything. She was shocked and couldn't understand why she didn't trust him, as he always protected her. He looked at her intently and whispered quietly that he loved her. With tears in her eyes, she said that she also loved him and asked him not to die. Servan looked at his friend and called him. The young man told the young league that it was time for them to go. Adelia screamed that she would not go anywhere because she did not want to leave her love. He looked at her intently and with tears in his eyes said that she had no need to cry for him. He wanted her to be happy. The young lady, in turn, was very sad. It was difficult for her, and she did not want to let him go. Servan looked at his friend and told him to take care of the young lady. He was happy because he was able to see his beautiful, beloved one last time. He was able to say goodbye, and a smile froze on his face. He saved the last of the Gerard line. The people of Erlis hated the young lady's father, and so they came and burned the castle. Adelia Gerard fled to the country of Elaine Servan, had arranged in advance for her to have a place to spend the night that night. The young lady was furious. She knew that he would never forgive her fiancé. She knew perfectly well that he had killed her father as well as her lover. She knew that the Ray, no matter what, would overthrow him from the throne. The young lady grieved greatly for her lover. At that moment, the young lady could not even imagine that it was then that the wheel of fate began to turn. The young lady was surprised. She did not understand why her whole body ached. She had the feeling as if she was sleeping on the bare floor. A moment later, she woke up and froze in place. The lady was confused. Looking around, she wondered where she was, as she had fallen asleep in a different place. The young lady froze in place as she saw a familiar jar of ointment. A moment later, she heard some noise. The young man was asking Servan if he had seen my lady. She walked quickly to the door because she wanted to see who was talking. The young man looked at his friend and told him not to worry, as my lady often does what she wants. The young lady froze in place in shock as she saw her lover who was alive. She froze looking at him because she knew that he was dead, but now she saw that he was talking to the maid. The maid looked at him playfully and said with a smile that he could come to see her at night. He looked at her intently and said that he was busy. The maid was offended and said that men always turn up their noses. She said that he was simply incorrigible. The young lady, in turn, watched them closely, wondering if this was a dream. But a moment later, she realized that she was in the past. At that time, she was constantly offended by him because the maid chatted with him. The maid also brought him fruits. She said with offense that the fruits were tasteless and told him to go to the forest and find other berries. She acted this way because she was very jealous of him. She knew that he was a slave at that time, and he barely had time to sleep. She didn't expect that he would go into the forest where the monsters lived and bring her other fruits. She saw the terrible calluses on his hands. She was puzzled because she understood that he had to work through pain. She looked at him and understood what a gap in status there was between them. One day, she felt regret and wanted to apologize for her antics, so she went into his room. It was her first time there. She knew the room smelled strongly of hay, and now she understood why he was emitting that aroma. She mentally asked him for forgiveness. She knew that this time she would ask him for forgiveness, as she should. But when she remembered what she saw, she became very angry. Then she said nasty things to him and hit him in the face. Unfortunately, it was all because of jealousy. At that time, Adelia had just married the prince. She tried to be glad that she was not marrying Servani. She constantly denied her feelings for the young man, as she thought that falling in love with a slave humiliated her dignity as the daughter of a margrave. But when she finally admitted to herself that she loved him, he died, and she unfortunately went on the run. Even in her last minutes, she could not protect him. He looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what she was doing there. Adelia, in turn, froze, looking at him with tears in her eyes. A moment later, she burst into tears and asked him for forgiveness. Servan looked at her in surprise and asked if she was in pain. He was puzzled and did not understand why she was crying. It was the first time he saw her cry frozen in place. He wondered what he should do. He looked at her and asked if she was hurt. Adelia said that she had been unfair to him, and that was why she had come to treat his hands. Adelia stood frozen in place as he wiped away her tears, knowing his hands were very warm. He looked at her in surprise and called out. The young lady said that she felt warmth. She wondered in surprise if she was going crazy because she thought this was reality. She said with a smile that it was a bit wide, but still nice. He looked at her in surprise. She looked at him with a smile and asked why he was standing still. She called him to her with a playful smile, and the young man looked at her in surprise. Adelia, with an embarrassed smile, told him to come to her. He froze in shock and asked what she was talking about. Looking at her, he asked if this was a dream. She asked with a smile if it made any difference, whether it was a dream or a fantasy of one of them. She said with a smile that he was already 18 and had grown up a lot, and he was confused and wondered what she was even talking about. Adelia asked in surprise why she was seeing him in front of her now. She sighed heavily and said that she had just fallen asleep and ended up here. She looked at him with a smile and said that she was still very pleased to see him, but it still frightened her. The young lady looked closely at his hands and said that she could even feel the warmth of his body. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she had been drinking wine by any chance. She froze, looking at the young man, and asked what he was talking about. He said that if she felt ill, he would bring a doctor, and he also asked her to let go of his hand. She said with a smile that since this dream was so pleasant, she should do in it everything that she had not managed to do in reality. She said with a smile that she didn't know if she would ever see him again. She said that she still regretted sending him into the forest. The young lady asked, puzzled, why he went, wondering what would have become of her if he had died. He looked at her in surprise and called out. He was puzzled and did not understand why she was crying. She said that she would certainly take him to the doctor. Adelia looked at him sharply and apologized for yelling at him. A moment later, they froze in shock as they saw a bright glow. She was in shock and didn't understand what had happened as she saw that the magic bracelet made of stones was glowing. Servan was a Seligilian, a nomadic people of the north. They are distinguished by their physical strength and endurance, but weak in magic. But unfortunately, they could not use magic crystals, and therefore they were in the minority in the empire. And their culture was considered backward, and they were often oppressed into slavery. The Imperials often made fun of them, saying that if these people had even a drop of magic, they would be invincible. Servan was just like that. He was a slave gladiator and was used in fights in the Colosseum. His father took pity on him and bought him out of slavery. Unlike all Seligilians, he was born with a strong magical ability. In a sense, he was a heretic. She knew that when the magic bracelet came into contact with a person, it only reacted when it was a more powerful magician. She was surprised, looked at him, and asked how the magic bracelet could react to him. She asked in surprise, since when did he know about his power? He said that he was not dangerous to her. He said that this was his first time touching first-class crystals, and he didn't do anything, and he didn't even control it. She said that wasn't the point at all. She looked at him intently and said that they were reacting to me, despite the fact that he was a Selagilian. She asked in surprise. Did this not even surprise him? She was puzzled, since she had never met such a powerful magician before. She looked at him intently and asked when he discovered magic in himself. Servan said that during his origin, before becoming a slave, he had seen several magic crystals. She was surprised. She asked in surprise why he didn't run away if he knew about his power. A moment later, they heard a distinct noise outside the door and froze, looking at the door. A few minutes later, a young man entered the young man's home and called out to him, but he was surprised when he saw no one. Servan quietly whispered to the lady that she could punish him for this. But later, Adelia froze looking at him as she saw that he had hidden them with magic. The young people were a little puzzled as they had clearly heard voices earlier, but when they entered they saw no one. The young people froze in place as they saw someone approaching them. The young lady was shocked as she realized that the young men were approaching them. The young man looked at his friend and said that they should leave, as there was no one in the room. The young man was a little puzzled and wondered if he had just heard it all. Servan looked intently at the young lady and apologized for his behavior. The young lady, in turn, was very confused. She wondered if this was a dream or a vivid fantasy. She looked at him intently as she was puzzled and could not believe what was happening. They stared at each other for a moment without saying a word. He looked at her and, with a soft smile, said that he would never leave her or betray her. He said that he would not look for magic crystals and perform magic. He said that he liked it there and he didn't want to leave, and he also asked her not to drive him away. The young lady froze in place as she did not expect to hear such a thing. She had no idea what was happening and wondered if it would hurt if he hit her. She asked him to hit her. The young man looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what she had just said. She said that he would never hit her, so she would do it herself. He looked at her in surprise and asked her, puzzled, what she was doing. He looked at her closely and asked if she was sure she was okay. She replayed his apology in her head. She saw his sad look. Adelia glared at him as she used to get angry when he kept apologizing. Now she felt the hot rays of the sun from the window looking at him. She looked at him intently and wondered if she was dreaming, and if this was all reality. The young lady sighed heavily. She understood that she had no reason to live any longer. To her regret, she lost the people dearest to her. Her father and lover died from poisoning. The poison is given death. From it is very painful and agonizing. They both drank it and died. Adelia knew perfectly well that this was the prince's work. She knew that her father was stern in appearance, but behind his sternness there was a kind heart. They rarely saw each other as he was busy with his duties to protect the fatherland, but she knew that he loved her more than anyone in the world. She knew that the prince had set up her father. She hated the one who gave up the throne to the prince, since from that moment on, troubles began in her family. She went back in time, and luckily, her father was alive. She wondered if it was true, because she couldn't believe what was happening. The young lady, in turn, knew that she should not run away from reality. She knew that if this was a dream, then she had to make it a reality. She wanted to change everything. She wanted to help Servan so that he could master the control of the magical crystals. She wanted to help him escape in the future. Unfortunately, she didn't want to break up with him at all, as she knew that their separation would last about 4 years. She knew there was less than a month left, and she had to help him get stronger. The young lady sighed heavily, wondering why he didn't want to run away. She knew he always protected her, and her family loved him. Adelia was very glad that she was able to be alone as she collected her thoughts. She looked in the mirror and saw that her plump cheeks were still there, as she had been exhausted before her return. She was basically 19 years old, but now she knew what she had to do. She had to become the winner in the endless war. She knew that if she lived to be 23, and nothing worked out, she would simply come back again. Adelia knew that the Gerard family had always protected the homeland of Erlis, but she understood that they would inevitably be betrayed. Adelia understood that they had to get ahead and give it to her first. She wanted to deprive the prince of his luck. The young man looked at his friend and said that they needed to go unload the cart. Servan looked closely at his friend and agreed with him. Meanwhile, the young lady watched the young man closely from the window, wondering when it all began. Erlis Empire was strong in its production of magic crystals, and there was also another empire, Elaine. Elaine was home to many nationalities, and the country had an inevitable conflict with Erlis, which bordered both sunny countries. Due to the International Non-Aggression Pact against Sonia, which is home to first-class magic crystal mines, Erlis and Elaine waged war for dominance in the market for this valuable resource. And in this war, Servan became a hero, but not Irlissa, but Elaine. She knew that it was all for her and her father. The main target of Erlis, or rather Prince Erlis, was the Gerards. Adelia wanted to take revenge on the prince. For all the torment, she wanted to cut off his head and pull all the veins out of him. She walked slowly to bed, knowing she had to get up after midnight that night. She thought that someone else had taken her hostage, otherwise she would have nothing at all, and life would be much harder. Adelia thanked Servan mentally for everything he did for her, but she knew that this time she would definitely help him and save him from imminent death. Late at night, the young lady woke up and went out to carry out her plan. Servan saw that something was wrong with the young lady. Previously, she constantly sent him on errands, but now for some reason she stopped. He was a little worried, because he remembered how she looked at him. He didn't understand what was going on at all since she had previously taken out all her anger on him. A moment later, he froze and turned around, as he felt that someone was watching him. He was surprised, because he noticed that someone was sitting in the bushes. He wondered who it could be since the man had hidden himself so that even a blind man could notice him. He sighed heavily as he still couldn't see who was hiding in the bushes. But a moment later, he saw that it was a young lady. He was surprised and didn't understand why she was hiding at such a late hour. Servant turned around with lightning speed as he wanted to pretend that he had not noticed anything. After a while, he hid himself as if he had decided to expose her, but he thought it was very sweet of her. A moment later, he saw a glowing trail and wondered if it was from an illusion spell. He was surprised and puzzled because he did not understand why the young lady was casting a spell. He did not understand what she was going to do. At the same time, a young lady was hiding in the crowd. She was a little puzzled as it was terribly cold and her hair was constantly getting in her face. She turned around, looking at the market, because she wanted to see if there was a shop selling hairpins somewhere. She looked at the bench where the hairpins were and suddenly saw a servant. She was surprised and did not understand what he was doing there. He apologized and said that he had not meant to follow her at all, but was still afraid that someone would offend her at such a late hour. She was shocked and screamed that it was not that, as he could have died because of it. He said that he was following her at a safe distance. She looked at him in surprise and asked if this was really possible. She knew that the slave brand on his neck was actually magical. It will explode if it moves too far from its owner and from the house. If she had known that he was following her, she would have deactivated this brand. Adelia wondered why she hadn't thought of doing this before. She wanted to remove the brand and let him go home. She came closer to him to do this, but he pulled away. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was doing. He walked around her and said that he would like to braid her hair now. The young lady looked at him with confusion and surprise and asked what he was talking about. Adelia in turn knew that he braided her hair every day. She remembered how she grumbled every time she didn't like her hairstyle and he had to redo it, and now she felt ashamed of it. She froze in place, embarrassed, as she hadn't felt his hands on her hair for a long time. She asked who he learned this from. He said that he had a sister because she was fidgety. She had a constant mess on her head, and so he braided her hair. She sighed heavily and said that she didn't know that he had a sister. She was very curious about what happened to his sister. Sivan looked at the lady intently and said that there was something he wanted to show her. She was surprised because she saw a 6th grade crystal. He said that he could help her with magic, since this crystal increased his power. She asked in surprise if he had really had the magic stone with him all this time. He said that he was really lucky, but he was giving it to her now because she could do better with it. She looked closely at the stone and knew she had to deal with the brand immediately. Adelia didn't know if he would like what she was about to do. Adelia came closer to him and said that they would do something better. A moment later, a bracelet with magic stones appeared on his wrist. He said that he did not need a magic stone at all since he was an Arab. He asked in surprise how she would cast a spell if she gave the bracelet to him. She said that this bracelet was already 2 years old and she would buy a new one. He looked at her closely and with a soft smile said that he was ready to wear it for her. She said that she had things to do, but he could come home. She looked at him intently and said that she would remove the brand immediately so that he would be safe. He said that she could kill him, but he would not let her do it. She said in shock that she would never kill him. He looked at her intently and said that in that case, she could give him her permission to go with her. He glanced sideways at the young lady and asked why she had come here alone. He said he didn't know what she was going to do there, but she could entrust it to him. She said she had come for a meeting. He asked her, surprised and puzzled, what meeting they were talking about. At the moment, it seemed to her that he was simply taking her into account. She sighed heavily as she created a semicircular barrier of illusions. It was crooked, and she was even ashamed to show it like that. But on the other hand, the less competent she looked, the more impudent they would be. He looked at her and said that it was a wonderful job. He said that if she got tired, he would help her. But suddenly they heard some noise in the distance. With the speed of lightning, he shielded the young lady with his body. The man shouted angrily at the young man to stop. A moment later, the man caught the slave and angrily asked if he really wanted to run away. The man used physical force against him. The young man shouted that he was not a slave at all, but an Irlesian. The young lady looked intently into the distance, wondering what was going on. The man shouted that there was no brand on the young man. The young lady in turn froze looking at the young man. Servant covered her face with his hand so that she would not see such a sight. He told her not to look. She pushed him away and said that she needed this young man, as she had to help him. He asked her in surprise why she needed this scoundrel. She looked at him and a moment later said that her luck depended on this guy. A moment later, she used her magic because she wanted to help the young man. The man froze in place, not expecting to feel magic behind him. A moment later, the man shouted to his accomplice that they were being followed by a yak. There are quite a few mages in this world, but there are very few combat mages among them. For this reason, in the ancient dialect, they are called few in number, namely Iak. The level of her magical powers was worrying, but Adelia was a mage, and she knew she had to get rid of the mercenaries. She knew that, as a noble lady, she had every right to punish those who oppressed and robbed the people. A moment later, she struck. The mercenaries were shocked. They began to run without looking back. She was surprised as she had struck with a clear trajectory. She wondered if she could really do that at 19 years old. She wondered if her friend had helped her. He looked at her and asked if he should detain the man. She said that they needed to catch his pursuers first, since they needed to be taken and handed over to the guards, and the guy needed to be escorted home. She looked at Servan with a smile and said that he could take the rope. He looked at the young lady with puzzlement and surprise, and asked if she really wanted to accompany the young man home. Adelia didn't expect such a reaction, but a moment later, she said that she needed to accompany him to his own house. He looked at her and still agreed, and also said that she needed to wait for him here while he did everything. A moment later, the young lady saw that everyone was tied tightly with ropes. She looked closely at the young men as they reminded her of dried fish. Servan looked intently at the young man and asked the lady if she should tie him up too. The young man, in turn, was very frightened and trembled as he looked at Servancy. Servan saw that the mercenaries began to cut the ropes. Lady distracted him and called. He looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what he should do next. A moment later, the man rushed at him with lightning speed. Adelia screamed and called for Servan as she saw the mercenary running towards him with a knife. Servant turned around with lightning speed and neutralized the enemy. Adelia rushed to Servan. She was worried because the mercenary suddenly attacked. He said that he was fine, and she did not need to worry. Adelia noticed that he was scratched and asked him not to put himself in danger. Servan looked at the lady in surprise, as he did not expect her to behave like that. But a moment later, his expression changed, and with an embarrassed smile, he said that he would try not to do that again. She looked at him closely and said that they needed to start with the face, as she didn't want him to have a scar. A moment later, she pulled away from her friend as she heard a noise behind her. Milady looked intently at the young man, for she knew that she had finally caught her luck. She came closer to him and extended her hand to him. The young lady looked at him with a smile and said that it was time for them to go. The young lady glanced sideways at the maids, who were tending to the young man's wounds. She sighed heavily as she tried to talk to him, but unfortunately, he fainted, and she would have to come tomorrow. Everyone envied his artificiality, because despite his frail appearance, he remained an outstanding master of blacksmithing. She knew that if he fell into slavery, he could only belong to Elkarian. She was very glad that she was able to steal it. She told Servan that if he wanted to ask her about something, he should not be shy. He looked at her puzzled and asked why she needed a blacksmith. She said with a smile that she needed him, and also asked if he really wanted to be a blacksmith for her. Servan looked away in embarrassment and said that if my lady so wished he would become a blacksmith. She thought for a moment because she knew he would succeed, but in turn, she understood perfectly well that he must become a warrior. She looked at him sideways and asked him not to die as he should not perish. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she suddenly started talking about this. The young lady said that he must promise her that he would not die. He looked at her excitedly and said that he would promise her this. He looked at her intently and said that his life, death, and everything else belonged only to her. She looked at him intently and said that the blacksmith was needed not only by her, but by both of them. Servan looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She said that when he came to his senses, she would order him to forge a sword and tell him to insert a magic crystal. She said that whoever he was, he needed a sword. He looked at her and said that he understood everything, but still it was too much for him. Adelia looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. She said that she could not wield a sword. He sighed heavily and said that he was a slave and had a brand on his neck. She looked at him in surprise and asked why he was clinging to the brand. Adelia said that she could take him off in no time, and she didn't see him as a slave. She also asked him not to look at her as his mistress. She knew he would never leave her side unless she removed the mark from him. The young lady sighed heavily, looking at her companion. A moment later, she came closer to him and extended her hand. She said that it was time for them to go. She looked at his hand in surprise and wondered if he had ever held her hand before. The young people walked slowly. Adelia asked if he could bring her all the pots of Rimla. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really needed everything. Servan knew very well that the aroma from them was very strong. She knew that in 4 years the war would begin, and it would be followed by an epidemic, a terrible fungal disease that would cause necrosis. The cause of this disease will not be known, and soldiers with weakened immune systems will be highly susceptible to it. The cure for the terrible bottom disease is Rimla. She knew that many seedlings of this plant were grown in greenhouses even before it became scarce. She knew she had to dilute it so much that she had many times more than the prince. She wanted to do everything possible to make sure they were armed with the medicine. She said with a smile that she really loved the smell of this herb. Adelia smiled and said that she would grow it in the garden, and then there would be a wonderful aroma everywhere. He looked at her intently and said that he would certainly plant the grass wherever the young lady ordered. He looked closely at the young lady, for he knew what the gesture meant. When a Selejalian plants flowers in the girl's garden, he knew perfectly well what it meant when he confessed his love to her. He looked closely at the young lady, as he knew that she was not familiar with this tradition. The young lady asked him shyly if they could plant flowers together. He knew that if a girl continued to care for a flower, it meant that she reciprocated his feelings. He knew that she didn't know about this either. Servan, in turn, sheepishly agreed with the young lady and also asked when they could begin. Adelia looked at Servan, who was in the distance, and called him. She asked him with a smile if he was bored. He smiled and said that he was not. She said that they could go home now. She was a little worried because there were too many seedlings. He said that she didn't need to worry because he would take them all away. She said he could give her 1 box. He said he had fixed them with magic, and they would not fall apart. She was excited and said that he had already used magic several times, and also asked since when he had been casting spells. She knew that he was only 9 years old when he was brought to their house. She knew that at that age, he should already be independent. He said that he was initiated into wars at the age of 8, and in Selejalian warrior is Tara. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he really knew magic. He looked at her with a smile and said that the life he was living now made him happy. She thought that their life was very cruel since he became a warrior at a young age. A few minutes later, she used magic to make the boxes a little lighter. She said it was foolish to miss the opportunity to make her job easier. He said with a smile that he doesn't want to do it because it's not hard for him, but sometimes he is also a little lazy and cunning like now. She looked closely at her friend as she realized that she had used up all her magical power and was very tired. He looked at her in surprise and asked what had happened to her. Servan said that the boxes were very light, and even a child could carry them. She asked in surprise if he really wanted her to carry them. He said that was not so, since she was probably tired. He asked if she wanted to take his magic power. She was taken aback for a moment, as she knew that the method of transferring magic power was very simple. The recipient's skin with his lips, or suck in air. The young lady was filled with embarrassment as she thought about it. She knew they were almost home, and her mana would be restored after she slept. She had heard before that it was very pleasant, and she would like to try it. She slowly offered her hand to Servan. He looked at her intently and asked if he could do it. She looked away shyly and said that she gave him her hand, so it was okay. He looked closely at the back of her hand and said that he would do everything now. A moment later, he kissed her hand tenderly. The young lady froze in embarrassment and asked him to stop. She was surprised as the power surged through her insides. With tears in her eyes, she asked him to stop. He said that he didn't hear her and also said that he was the first to do something like this, and that's why it might have turned out awkwardly. She was in shock because she didn't know that it would be exactly like this. He apologized and said he should have stopped right away, but he couldn't. She could see he was even more shocked than she was. She wanted to try to appear reserved and said with a smile that she was fine. She said he could do it differently next time. He asked if there would be a next time. She said she would need his help. She looked at him in surprise and asked what had happened to him. He timidly said that he needed to be alone. The young lady was surprised and wondered if there was something wrong with him. She asked if he was in pain. Servan unconsciously pushed her away when she wanted to touch him. She froze in shock and wondered if he had hit her. He asked for forgiveness in a puzzled tone for what he had done and said that he wanted to be alone. A moment later, he ran away from her with the speed of lightning. She was in shock as she did not expect such a thing from him. The young lady in turn stared out the window and pondered what had happened. A moment later, she saw him through the window and wondered what his look meant. She knew that yesterday he hit her and just ran away, but she understood that she couldn't leave him alone. A moment later, Adelia knocked on the window, and he froze in place. Adelia looked at him intently and told him to get up and come to her immediately. The young lady looked out the window. She was very angry. She knew that if he did not come to her, then she would go to him herself. With lightning speed, she went to bed and primped herself a little. For some time, she sat and waited for him alone. She was puzzled and did not understand why he had not come yet. She wondered furiously if he had run away again. She knew they were supposed to plant flowers together. A moment later, she was taken aback as she heard a knock on the door. Servan Tico said that he had arrived. He looked at her and said that he had been standing there for some time and pretended that he had not been peeping. The young lady turned away in embarrassment and, sighing heavily, said that he could go out. He looked at her intently and asked if she had called him. The young lady froze in place with embarrassment as she saw that he had washed his face. She was surprised and did not understand why he did this. She said that he should massage her hand. Since she was very tired, he asked if he could give her magical power. She looked at him intently and said that this time he should stop when she said so. He said that she could lie down as she felt comfortable. He came closer to her and, looking at her intently, said that she must accept his power and also must tell him when to stop. Moments later, they froze in shock as someone called out to the young lady. Adelia in turn was very embarrassed. She shouted that she had said earlier, "Do not bother her with trifles." The maid said that Mr. Fahilton had brought her the family ring, so she ran to tell her, taken aback. She realized that her cousin had arrived to see her. Servan said that Fahilton could only come on the orders of the commissioner, but he ran away. She was furious and did not understand how he dared to run away. He looked intently at the young lady and said that there was a way to find him. She looked at him in surprise and asked what method he was talking about. Servan used magic to look around the entire city. She was surprised that he could use search magic. She was shocked since she didn't know how to do this. She looked at Servan in surprise and asked where he ran off to. He said that the young man was running straight towards them. She sighed heavily as she wanted to plant a flower with him, but everything went down the drain. The young lady asked him to try to avoid violence, as the young man had valuable skills. He sighed heavily and said that he would obey her. Servan thought about what the young lady had told him. He wanted her to depend only on him. He wanted to break both of the young man's arms so that he would be of no use to her, and that the young lady would no longer need him. He was puzzled by the fact that he could experience the shameful pleasure of giving her his magical resources. He knew that she didn't understand what was happening, and that she trusted and relied on him completely. He knew that was more than he could hope for. A moment later, he heard a noise in the distance and saw a young man. The young man didn't see anyone. He ran past Servan, but he tripped him, and the young man fell to the ground with a crash. Servan looked closely at the young man and asked if he was hurt. Servan said that he thought that since the young man had quickly run away from the doctor, it meant that he was completely healthy, and the young man asked for forgiveness for his behavior. Servan looked at the young man intently and said that he would do whatever the young lady ordered. Servan looked at the young man and told him to shut his mouth and follow him if he wanted to live. A moment later, the young man fell to the ground with a crash. Adelia looked closely at Servan and asked if he had caught it. Servan picked up the young man and shouted to the young lady that he had done everything. The young man was puzzled and did not know what he had planned. Servan looked at the young man and said that he might fall, and therefore he would support him. The young lady looked at them in surprise and asked what happened. At the same time, the young man was screaming and begging for help. Servan was furious at the behavior of the young man and pushed him away as he did not want to help him. The young lady looked at the young man in surprise and asked why he was asking to be saved. She said that she was not going to kill him. She said that he should think for himself why she had to treat him and then kill him. Adelia looked closely at the young man and said that he had already learned that trying to run would not lead to anything good. She said that he was a very important person and they should talk. Servan looked closely at the young man and said that he was now panicking because he did not know what was happening. The young lady looked at him closely and said that he looked as if his heart was hurting. She asked how he was feeling. He said that he was a little tired and also wanted to do it with her. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. She froze as she realized that he had used complex magic and expended a lot of effort. She looked at him and asked if he was really tired. He said that he was. He looked at her intently and said that tonight he wanted to feel freedom with her. He asked if she agreed. The young man watched the young people closely as they entered into a casual conversation. He looked at them intently, as it did not seem surprising to him, since the girl had reasons for behaving so obediently. He knew that no one would worry about him in a situation like this, since he was just a monster. He was shocked and did not understand how a young man could treat a little girl like that. She knew that according to imperial law, if someone steals money, he will have to compensate for the damage 12-fold. She looked intently at the young man and said that if he ran away, he was no different from a thief. A moment later, she calculated the compensation he had to pay her. He froze in shock as she told him the amount he had to pay. She looked at him intently and with a sly smile said that if he couldn't give it all back right away, then the interest would grow every day. The young man froze because he saw a demon in her. The young lady looked at him and said with a smile that there was another way to make amends. She handed him a scroll of paper. He looked at her in bewilderment and asked how he could do this, since it was the first time he had seen such a drawing. She said with a smile that there was another drawing and asked if he would like to see it. The blacksmith's blood boiled in his veins, and with a mischievous smile, he said that he would like to see it. Unlike the current weapons, this weapon not only increased Aya's attack power, but also allowed an ordinary soldier to use the power of Aya's face. She knew that no matter what, these weapons would undoubtedly be created by the young man. She looked at him with a smile and said that if he signed a contract with her, she would give him the drawings since she didn't need them anyway. He looked at her with a smile and agreed, his eyes shining as he wanted to quickly start creating beautiful weapons. The young lady plopped down on the bed with lightning speed. She sighed heavily because she was very tired. She remembered the young man. She was surprised because she did not think that he would ask many questions. Even her tongue hurt from explaining everything to him in detail. She looked at her companion in surprise and asked if there really was no shift in his room, since she only saw candles. He sighed heavily and said that unfortunately, he simply did not have enough time for this. He looked at her closely and asked if it was too dark for her. The young lady in turn timidly said that it was not so, but she was well aware that the room was dark, and this made her feel more nervous. She knew it was nothing to worry about, but she didn't understand why she was acting like that. She knew she could do it if she wanted, so she didn't need to be nervous. She looked at him intently and said that in any case, they would not be disturbed, like in her room. She said that this time he did not need to stop, even if she told him to stop. She said that he did not need to ask anything, and he could do whatever he wanted. She looked at him in surprise and asked what was wrong with him. He looked at her closely and said that she had a habit of clutching the blanket when she was nervous, and she could hurt her hands. He said that she need not worry, as he would stop right away if she said Adelia. With a smile, said that she would say such a thing. He smiled and said that he knew it. He looked at her intently and said that if she did say it, he would definitely get it. She sighed heavily and said that she would just stop if she didn't have the desire. The young lady timidly said that he could get down to business. He looked at her intently and said that he would begin. Now Servan slowly reached for her neck. The young lady, in turn, sighed heavily. He quietly whispered to her not to strain her hands, as they were still injured. The strange and unpleasant magical power that he felt on the other side was not the magical power of Milady or Gerard. It was the power of a stranger. He was furious and did not understand how they dared. He did not know who it could be. The young lady was shaking. She asked him to stop, as she could not stand it anymore. He looked at her and said that he needed to check something as he felt strange magic. He asked if she knew anything about it. Trembling, she said she didn't know anything. She asked if they could do it tomorrow. He said he would definitely finish it all in one go, as he just needed to check. He looked at her intently and shyly, calling her name, asked permission to continue. Adelia froze in embarrassment, as this was the first time he had asked her for something, and called her by name. Adelia sighed heavily and agreed with him. She was in shock and did not understand what he was even saying, and wondered if she had gone crazy. Servan looked at her closely and thanked her with a smile, and also said that he would quickly sort everything out, so she should not worry. The prince gazed intently at the beautiful crystal that towered above him, but a moment later he froze in place in shock as the crystal shattered into pieces after he touched it. He froze in place in shock, and touching his face, he realized that the magic had been dispelled. Servan looked guiltily at the young lady and asked worriedly if she was okay, as he had called her, but she did not answer. She sighed heavily and said that she was still alive and conscious, so he had no need to worry. Servan looked at her closely and asked her worriedly if she was tired. She was a little surprised, as she did not understand why he was asking such a thing. Adelia looked at him with a puzzled smile and said that she would rest a little and would be as good as new. She really wanted to cry, but she knew that he would be worried, so she could not get angry. Servan looked at her closely and asked her to drink some water. He said that she needed to open her mouth, and he would give her something to drink. The young lady was surprised, as drops and water flew straight into her mouth. She looked at him in surprise and asked if she could really drink water like that. He asked with a soft smile if she liked it. She smiled and said that it was wonderful. The young lady looked at him intently and said that he had already used a lot of magic, but he could still do this. She said that she thought she was just finished. He asked for forgiveness in surprise. She sheepishly said that everything was fine. It was a pity that she ran away after that. Adelia asked if he was happy this time, and also asked him to finish this time. She looked at him intently and asked if he was unhappy. He timidly said that it was not so, and that he was even very happy. Servan looked at her closely and said that there was one more thing he wanted to check, as there was some strange magic on her body, but luckily it didn't look like a curse. She was surprised, as she knew that every year many doctors and priests examined her. She looked at him closely and asked if they could have just missed it. Servan said that it seemed to have been applied in such a way that it would not be detectable. She asked if he really wanted to say that they weren't monsters like him, and that's why they couldn't find her. He looked at her in surprise and bewilderment and asked what she was talking about. She said that she was talking about his formidable magical abilities, not about him. He said that such complex magic spells are difficult to find unless someone has a grasp of telepathy theory. He said that he couldn't even imagine who did it, and why Adelia knew that before the regression, she had never been in a life-threatening situation until she was 20 years old. She knew that now she was a simple, unremarkable girl, but still this situation worried her very much, since she did not know who did this and why he looked at her, and asked if they should find traces of spells, it would not cause her any harm. He looked at her closely and said that he had a bad feeling about this. He said that since the spell had broken, the spellcasters should have noticed it. Servan looked at her intently and said that if necessary, he would delete it also, If she didn't mind, he could check on her every day. Servan was taken aback and said that the trail quickly disappeared. The young lady looked at the young man in surprise. Adelia looked at him in bewilderment and asked why he was blushing. She did not understand why he was acting like that. A moment later, she looked at him closely and asked where he would check. Servan timidly said that he needed to check the back of the head. The back, she sighed heavily, and said that she was very glad that it was not the front. She was very worried because she might sweat, and he would smell something unpleasant on her. She knew that she needed to show herself in the best light, not the worst. He looked at her closely and said that since magic was through touch, he would have to touch certain areas, and it might be uncomfortable, but he would have to narrow down his search to find it. The young lady looked at him intently. A moment later, she said that it was not his fault, so there was no need for him to make such an expression. She knew that this was all really happening. Milady looked at him sheepishly and said that she was about to undress, so he needed to put out the candles. She was going to show him the maturity of an older man, and he sheepishly agreed with hers. After he extinguished the candles, the young lady stood frozen in place, as unfortunately she could not see anything. She was puzzled because there were no windows in the room, and it was very dark. Various thoughts were spinning in her head, but a moment later, she said that she couldn't reach her back, and asked him if he could help her. Servant froze in shock. He looked into the darkness in surprise, and asked if she really wanted him to help her. She timidly asked him for help, as she knew that this magic would be easier to detect if she undressed. He slowly approached her and asked her for forgiveness. He slowly began to undress her. The young lady froze in place as her heart was beating very fast. She knew that it was all because this was the first time she interacted with him like this. She wondered if he had similar feelings. She really wanted to know what he was feeling now, and if he saw her as a girl. A moment later, he said that he had found what he was looking for. She was surprised, looked into the distance, and asked if it had really happened that quickly. He sighed heavily and said that everything was exactly like that. He slowly touched her back. A moment later, he clearly noticed the seal on her neck. It was trembling from his touch. The young lady looked at her assistant intently and asked if there was still nothing worth investing in. The young lady thought for a moment. She knew that quite a few people had touched her neck, and she hadn't even counted the maids yet. She understood that they could use the hair as an excuse. She looked closely at her assistant and wondered whose side he was on. She knew he was the butler who had taken care of Gerard since she was a child, but she knew his eyes were cold when he looked at the other butlers. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that this business would definitely fall apart. A moment later, she heard someone calling her. Turning around, she froze in place as she saw the crown prince in front of her. The prince looked at the young lady with a sly smile and said that they had not seen each other for a long time. The prince glanced sideways at those present and said that he and Adelia needed to talk. Everyone present bowed and left. The prince looked at the young lady with a smile and asked why she was silent. He looked at her in surprise and said that they hadn't seen each other for so long. The young lady in turn looked at him with fury as she realized that he was the nightmare that haunted her every night. Adelia was furious because the man who had taken everything from her was now standing in front of her and smiling, looking into her face. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that 4 whole years had already passed since the moment they first met in the capital, and she was only 15 years old then. The young lady was furious, for she had been thinking only of how to kill him, but she knew that now was not the time for it. She knew that the future had changed, and she did not expect that he would come to her so soon. She in turn wondered what had made him come to her, and what exactly had changed. The young lady in turn understood that she needed to find out this urgently. She looked at him with a smile and said that she was very surprised that he decided to visit her, and also asked him for forgiveness. She said that it was a great honor for her to meet him. She looked at him with her smile and wished him the blessing of Hasidian, the god of war. He looked at her in surprise and asked if you were on Arius, the god of love, last time. She said with a smile that he had become very handsome, so she first thought of Hasidian. In her past life, she thought he was a prince from a fairy tale. She wondered if he really thought she would pray to be blessed by the god of love. When people greet each other in the Earl's empire, they must pray for the blessing of God, the name of the god who leads the courage of man, the war god Hasidian. Hasidian is very cold and extremely fair, and is also known as the god of punishment. The young lady in turn looked at the prince with a grin. She really hoped that God would punish him. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that she had not grown up at all, and she was still not as wicked as a little child. He sighed heavily and said that he was tired of the terrible things in the capital. And now he was lucky enough to see her. The prince looked at her intently and said with a smile that he felt his heart was completely cleansed. The young lady in turn looked at him intently, with a smile on her face, but she was disgusted to hear all this. She knew that he now looked like a dried anchovy that had been grilled until golden brown. He looked at her closely and said that her father was simply heartless. It was like she was still too young to continue the family business. He slowly touched her face and said that if she had any problems, she should tell him. The young lady was puzzled and said that she agreed with him, but in turn, she was puzzled and could no longer tolerate his presence. He asked if he could stay at the estate for a while, as he would be back for dinner and would like to dine with her. A moment later, he said goodbye and left. The young lady stood frozen in shock. She was shocked and mentally sent him away as he forced her to have dinner with him. The prince looked at his assistant and asked if the Margrave was aware that he had arrived to see them. The young man sighed heavily and said that he thought the Margrave already knew about it. The prince said that it simply could not be that the stern old man had returned to the territory as soon as he learned of his arrival. The prince was surprised, as the lobster count did not even deign to take proper care of his daughter. He sighed heavily and wondered if he had done all this in vain. He came to find out whether she knew about it or not. The prince, in turn, saw perfectly well that the young lady looked normal. He understood that she would never know the truth, that goblin blood flowed in the Gerard clan, a noble family called to serve and protect people. This was evidenced by the characteristic color of the family's hair and eyes, that their blood had a strong resistance to curses. The family line was passed down through generations for more than 1,000 years. The prince, in turn, wondered why the curse was lifted. He knew that it had been cast a long time ago, so it was not so easy to lift. He wondered if it was a miscalculation. He thought that the magic stone could not withstand so much energy from the goblins. He understood that it was easy to reverse the curse, but the problem was with the magic stones of this size are very rare, and even he, the crown prince of the empire, had to spend more than 1 year searching for it. He understood that the only sensible decision now was to continue to monitor all of this. Selina looked intently at the prince and said that the sun was very strong. Bowing, she said that his skin might get sunburned, and therefore she thought it would be better for him to go into the shade. The prince looked at her intently and said with a smile that he had not had such a break for a long time. He thanked her for worrying about him. The prince, in turn, thought it was very interesting to create outstanding talents for his subordinates. It was like collecting and displaying jewelry. He was a little puzzled, and since he wanted to know even more, the prince looked intently out the window and noticed the slave Selegal. He was surprised as the young man looked very strong from the outside. He understood that even though he didn't look like he could use magic properly, he could somehow use the slave. A moment later, the prince saw a magic stone on his wrist. The young people froze in place. The prince came closer to her, and looking at the young man, said that from his appearance, you wouldn't know that he was so strong. The prince looked at the young man with a sly smile and said that people like him were rare among the Selagilians. Servan froze for a moment in surprise as he saw the other men bow their heads before the prince. A moment later, he placed the log on the ground and bowed down. The crown prince unsuccessfully approached the young man and, looking at him intently, told him to stand up. Servan, in turn, sighed heavily, but did as he was ordered. Without looking at the prince, he asked if he had called him. The prince, in turn, looked intently at the young man, and with a sly grin asked where he got the magic stone that was visible on his hand. The prince said that this was not something that a subordinate could have since the master's permission was required. The prince asked if Adelia had given him permission. Selina froze in shock as she saw the aura of murder. Servan looked at the prince and said that he got it for sometimes acting as the mistress's guard when she leaves the house. The prince looked at the young man in surprise and said that it was very interesting. He said with a grin that if the slave is useful, then this can be. He wanted to know how well he is in charge of magic stones, whether he can use third-level stones. The prince thought he was Aya. He asked with a smile if he was right. Servan said that he was right, because he was a Celagalian. He did not have much magical power. It was at a low level, he understood that he would have to adapt to this situation. Servan said that the third level is his limit, which means he can only use magic for attack. The prince looked at the young man closely, with a smirk on his face. He knew that, despite his humble demeanor, it was not unusual for him to also be a Yahoo. He thought that the young man was perhaps more insignificant than he thought. The prince looked at the young man closely and said that people like him should not rot in a place like this. He said that he could save him from slavery, no matter who he was. The prince looked at the young man with a smirk and asked if he wanted to come to him. Servan in turn looked intently at the prince. He was puzzled by such a question. He did not want to answer the question at all, but he understood that in front of him now stood a man in whose veins flowed royal blood. He understood that the young lady could be in danger, and he would have to give an answer. He looked at the prince intently and said that his mistress for the last 10 years had been Adelia Gerard, and she will remain so. He looked closely at the prince and asked if a slave was capable of choosing his own master. The prince looked at him with a grin and, sighing heavily, said that he too would not want to have a slave who could easily betray him. The prince looked at him intently and said with a smirk that he did not like people who missed their opportunity. He told the young man that if he had a brain, he would make the right choice. He looked at the young man intently and said in all seriousness that he would ask one more time. A few minutes later, he asked who his master really was. The young man calmly said that he had only one mistress. The prince was shocked. He sighed heavily at this statement and said that this dog also had a home. The prince looked at the young man with fury and told his subordinates to tie him to a tree. The young men looked at the slave with contempt. The young man handed Selena the bracelet and said that he would take it just in case, as it contained magic stones. Servant, he sighed heavily. Of course he hated with all his heart when he was beaten, but dealing with him was simply unbearable. He was a little worried and did not know what to do. He simply could not accept the fact that the young lady could suffer as a result of his actions. He understood perfectly well that nothing terrible would happen to him if he was beaten a little. The prince approached the young man and said that it seemed that Girard did not know how to properly raise a slave, since he saw that there was not a scratch on the young man's body. The prince in turn was surprised, as he saw that the young man was very calm and did not even tremble. The prince looked at him intently and said that now he would bear his punishment. And the reason for this was that he spoiled the mood of a representative of the royal family. He looked at him intently and said that he would punish him regardless of the number of his beatings. The prince looked at the slave with fury and contempt. He knew that he was just an insignificant dog and should get what he deserved. He knew that a slave should know his place. The young lady in turn sat quietly and thought about what was happening. She really wanted to save Servan. She understood that now she could give up everything for him. The young lady in turn understood perfectly well that no matter how perfect the prince's knights were, no one would be able to stop Servan. But she understood perfectly well that her father could suffer in this situation. She knew that if any member of the royal family died on her estate, then all the blame would fall on her father. The blame for the fact that he did not protect the royal family. She understood that her father would certainly be deprived of life. She sighed heavily as she wondered what he was thinking back then. Since he was lured into a trap, she was very angry as she knew that her dad was always honest. But despite everything, she really wanted to meet him. She knew that she must also meet with, who must certainly visit her estate, Hugh Crouch, the owner of the gallon store. Adelia knew very well that she could learn a lot from this man. In fact, he is more of a scholar than a merchant, because he even conducted his own research. But despite all this, none of the nobility had yet invested in him, so the situation with his research had hardly moved forward. The young lady thought for a moment about what would be suitable for working with him. She knew that they would definitely have to use magic stones and mana, but for a moment, she wondered if this would be suitable for research. A moment later, her thoughts disappeared, and then she heard a crash outside the door. A moment later, the butler burst into her office. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he had gone crazy. She did not understand why he was scaring her so much. He looked at her intently and asked for forgiveness. After catching his breath, He said that the prince wanted to punish Servan with the help of flacillatio. The young lady froze in shock as she realized that they were going to punish her lover with the whip. A moment later, she was running at full speed towards the young man in order to save him. She was furious and knew that a bastard like the prince would not even touch him with a finger. She was furious because she knew that anyone he touched would suffer because of him. The young lady in turn understood that she could not allow the prince to do this to Servani. With the speed of lightning, the young lady shielded her lover and shouted at the prince to stop. Servant froze in surprise, as he did not expect to see the young lady at all. And besides, she was protecting him. The prince looked at his bride in surprise and asked why her face had turned red. He was surprised and wondered if she had really run towards them. He did not understand why she behaved in such a way. The young lady in turn looked intently at the prince. She looked angrily at the prince and said that he was hers. The young lady said angrily that no one dared touch him in her presence. She said that if the young man did something wrong, she would certainly take full responsibility for his actions. The young lady looked intently at the prince and asked him to release the young man. The prince froze in place in surprise, as he did not expect to see or hear such a thing. He looked at the young lady intently and said that he was not an easy man. He said that he was the future ruler of the empire. He looked at the young lady intently and asked who gave her the right to stop him. The young lady looked at the prince intently and said that apparently he did not understand hers. She said that according to the laws of the empire, if a slave makes a mistake, his master can bear the full punishment instead of the slave, and now she declared that she would bear due responsibility. She looked at him intently and asked, "Shouldn't he as the crown prince be more obedient to the laws of the empire?" She said that she was not insulting him at all. The young lady in turn understood perfectly well that the law of the empire was the will of the emperor. She knew that even the crown prince could not go against the emperor in the presence of a large number of people. The crown prince looked closely at the young lady and sighed heavily. He remembered the law and said that everything was correct, and unfortunately, he was not yet on the throne. He looked at her intently and said that since she was still young, he would overlook the mistake this time, but next time it would be different. She looked at him intently and thanked him for his generosity. So if he sent her an errand, she would take responsibility. The prince looked at the young lady with fury. He understood that all this time she was pretending to be white and fluffy, but in reality, she was not like that. The prince looked at the young man and realized that, thanks to him, she had revealed her true nature. He felt sincerely sorry for them too, if they thought that everything would be so simple. He knew that unfortunately, they had gotten involved with the wrong person. The prince was furious because he knew that he would not forgive all this. So easily, he looked at the young lady and said that people still make mistakes. He swung his whip in anger because he wanted to punish the slave. Adelia froze in shock. Adelia screamed she was in shock because she was very scared. Adelia rushed towards the prince with lightning speed as she wanted to prevent him from striking. Adelia shielded Servan with her body, but the prince had no intention of stopping. Servan looked at the prince and his lady with fury. He could not allow the prince to strike the lady. He used his power against the prince, and he in turn fell with a crash to the ground, trembling in pain. All the knights were alarmed. They did not understand who dared to attack the prince. The young lady looked at the knight and said that she knew his spirit was wounded, but that was an assumption. She looked closely at the knight and asked if it was putting pressure on her little missus. She asked if they blamed her for what happened. She looked at the lady and said that if it turned out that it was the intruder, then she would also be in danger, and therefore she was worried about the young lady. Adelia looked closely at the knight and asked if she was blaming someone for the whims of heaven, since everyone saw perfectly well. The young lady looked at the knights closely and said that no one's magic stone reacted. She said that the magic stone is necessary for using magic. Aya can feel how it works. The lady looked closely at all the knights present and said that there were many of them here, and unfortunately, no one felt the magic. The knight in turn was silent and did not say anything. A moment later, she glanced sideways at the young lady and asked if they could avail themselves of their family's medical assistance. The young lady in turn sighed heavily and said that of course they could take advantage of this. The knight generously thanked the young lady for her help. The young lady in turn looked intently at the prince, who was being carried on a stretcher. She found it very funny and could hardly contain her laughter. A moment later, she looked at her friend and asked if he was okay. Servan K, as if nothing had happened, said that he was fine. She came closer to him and noticed that his wrist was bruised. He looked at her closely and said that he was fine, and also he wanted to ask her something. He asked the young lady if this happened again, what he should do. He looked at her intently and said that he had behaved rudely and seemed to have insulted the lady. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. Adelia said that they could not have kept him like that. Adelia said that first, they needed to change his clothes. The young lady froze in embarrassment as she looked at the young man. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she was okay. The young lady in turn was taken aback and said that she was fine. He came closer to her and took her hand. Servan was worried and asked if it was an accident that he touched her. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked what he was doing. She threw a shawl over him with the speed of lightning and told him to put it on. He looked at her in surprise. Some time later, she brought him to her room and told him to stay there, and she would come back when she finished work. She said that today he needed some rest, and she would tell everyone about it. He looked at her and said that he was not tired at all. He said he just needed to find a trusted item. She came closer to him and, looking him intently in the eyes, said that once this was over, he would need to rest. A moment later, she asked him for forgiveness. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she was very sorry. Servan looked at her and said that no matter what the lady did, he would always think that she was innocent. He said that he would like her not to apologize to him for anything. He said that if she wanted something, he would do it no matter what. The young lady froze in shock as she did not expect to hear such a thing. A moment later, she looked at him with a smile and thanked him. She said with a smile that she would reimburse him for everything later and asked him for help. He looked at her with bewilderment, but still agreed. The young lady left, leaving Servan alone in the room. A moment later, he was taken aback as his head began to hurt very badly. She sat and quietly thought about the whole situation. She remembered how the prince thought like an idiot. He was pleased that she was on his side. She knew that she was just an ordinary person from the slaves with little talent, nothing more than an object that could be replaced at any moment. She knew that no matter how hard she tried, she was still a toy. But even knowing all this, she continued to endure such treatment. She knew that day after day, it was impossible to get rid of suffering. A moment later, she was taken aback as she heard some sound. A moment later, she heard a man's voice. The man said that he had come to collect what was his. She froze in place as she recognized the young man. He looked at her intently and asked if she could give it to him. She froze in bewilderment, looking at the young man. But a moment later, she remembered that she had the young man's bracelet. She looked at him intently and asked if it was really about the bracelet. Servan looked at her intently and said that it was true since it originally belonged to the lady. She thought for a moment, as she didn't know how he knew she was here. She wondered if it was a coincidence or not. She knew she couldn't give him the bracelet without the master's permission. She knew he was a slave, but even so, his aura frightened her. A moment later, he stared at the bracelet that hung on his arm. She looked intently into his eyes. They were somehow familiar to her. It seemed to her as if she were looking into a reflection. Her body was reminded of familiar feelings. She knew that he was a slave who loved his master. She knew that they were similar, but she clearly understood that his situation was better than hers. She remembered how his mistress had fiercely defended him. She understood that the young lady treasured the young man very much. She looked at him closely and asked if this bracelet had really been given to him by his mistress, Servan. Calmly said that it was so. She was surprised because she didn't expect to hear something like that. She asked for forgiveness for taking him away earlier. Servant R turned around as if he was about to leave, but she shouted and said that she should have immediately returned it to the owner, but unfortunately, she could not. She asked him to stop, but he had already finished his dialogue. She rushed towards him as if she wanted to stop him, but the young man dodged her grasp with lightning speed. She was shocked as his movements were lightning fast. She understood that for an ordinary person, he had too high a talent. He looked at her intently and said that he was listening to her attentively. She understood that he was a Salagelian, and this amazed her even more. She knew that people like him were just expendable. that in this country, slaves of a different race had no future. She knew that, even if the mistress also loved him, he would still be unhappy. She knew perfectly well that his mistress would not allow anything to happen to him. She looked at him intently and said that she should not say this at all, but she wanted to give him one piece of advice. She said that one day his mistress would leave him, and therefore he could go to Elaine. Servant Z froze in shock, as he did not expect to hear something like this. A moment later, he came to his senses, and looking intently at her, said that this simply could not happen. The knight looked at him intently, and said that, unfortunately, she like him was a slave. She wondered if there was anything more meaningful than being freed from slavery. Without proof that she was their slave, she was not human. She was very scared and didn't know what to do. She looked closely at the young man, and said that they could go to a place where he could show more, and that he would be treated well there as a mercenary. She said that, unfortunately, she did not know if he would have the opportunity for anything more. The young lady in turn sighed heavily and stretched. She had been very overworked in recent days. The young lady knew that everything had been going well for you lately, so her mood was the same. Hicks, having regained his health, was developing weapons in the forge. The matter on which she was going to go to Hugh Crouch progressed without any particular problems. Although the prince appeared a little unexpectedly, in any case, she will set off on a journey as soon as she sees him off. She thought for a moment as she remembered that she had not told her friend that he was coming with her. She wondered if he would be surprised. The knight looked intently at the young lady and said that she would convey her respects to the prince. She said that she thought His Highness would be upset by her departure. The young lady in turn looked closely at the knight and asked him to be careful, and also wished them good luck on their journey. She looked closely at the lady and said that she very much hoped that the goddess Judas, the goddess of peace, would bless her. The young lady in turn thanked the knight for his blessing. A moment later, she froze, looking at the birds that were soaring in the air. She was surprised. Servant Z froze, staring intently at the birds, as there were so many of them. The young lady in turn looked closely at the young man, as he looked very cute. She did not take her eyes off the birds, as this was the first time she had seen anything like this. A moment later, she was in shock as the birds pooped on people. The young lady froze as the prince was also hit by the birds. The young men hurried because they knew they had to dry the prince quickly. The young lady in turn froze and could barely contain her laughter. Servan looked at his mistress with a smile, for he saw that she was very happy. Servan was casting his magic. The young lady looked at him intently and asked if he was finished. He sighed heavily and said that he was done for today. The young lady in turn sighed heavily and said that unfortunately she could not even imagine what it was like. As he was helping her and using his magic for healing purposes, her shoulders became a little bare. He said that he would help her and tie her dress. Embarrassed, he got down to business. She said he would be damned if he didn't touch her skin. She said he did it every day. She asked in surprise how he could tie her shoelaces without touching her body. He said he had practiced a lot, so he had experience. The young lady asked him how about untying his shoelaces. He froze in embarrassment. She asked him if he did this often. He nervously said that he had already finished, so he apologized. The young lady looked at him in surprise, but he shouted that he was already leaving and climbed onto the window. She looked at him in surprise and, puzzled, asked him to wait. She stared after him and did not understand why he was so embarrassed. She was surprised and did not understand how he could be so tall. The young lady in turn knew that she needed to start applying her actions right now. The young people looked at each other as they heard some strange noise. The young man was surprised. He saw nothing, but he felt something. He saw nothing in front of him, but he did not understand why the door suddenly opened. He knew that there were definitely traces of a person. Milady said that it was she. The knights looked at her in surprise and asked if it was really she. They asked in puzzlement if she had really used illusion magic, that she practices magic while walking. Haley, tomorrow morning, the knight said that he would certainly do everything, and also asked if she was really going to go alone. She smiled and said that everything was fine since she was going to the temple. And moreover, she is Ya. She said goodbye with a smile and said that they would see each other later. Ritter looked at her and said that even if she greeted him, he could not see it since it was just her illusion. The knights looked at the young lady in surprise, wondering if they should follow her. For a moment they thought and looked down, knowing she would be irritated by their actions. Servan was lying quietly in his house, but suddenly he froze because he heard someone's footsteps. He hid as he heard footsteps approaching him. A moment later, he felt someone's hand reach out to him. Son of lightning speed, he grabbed the young lady's hand. Adelia Z screamed as she was surprised. The young lady in turn tripped and fell right on top of him. She sighed heavily and said that it was very loud, and also asked if he was okay. He looked away from her in embarrassment and said that everything was fine. Servan timidly pulled himself up and asked the young lady, puzzled why she had come to him at such a late hour. He looked at her in surprise as he saw a backpack on her shoulders. He asked what it was. She looked at him with a smile and said that it was a backpack for traveling. She said that it only looked so massive, but with the help of magic, she made it light. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she was wearing it. The young lady looked at the young man intently and said that they were going on a trip. He froze in bewilderment. He looked at her intently and asked if they were going on a trip together. The young lady sheepishly said that they were. Servan P. stood up and looking at the young lady said that first, they needed to reduce the size of her backpack. He looked at the young lady and said that the backpack had been reduced in weight. However, the appearance was too noticeable. With the help of magic, he shrank the backpack with lightning speed. He looked at her closely and asked where she was going and how long she was planning on traveling. The young lady thought for a moment, and Adelia said that she needed to get to the lands of Gurtons. She said that she needed to get back before her father returned, so the journey would take about a week. They needed to travel by horse. She looked at the flower and asked if she should plant it by the roots. She said that the rest of the jeans garden would be planted in a different way, so they could do it together. Adelia looked at him in surprise and asked why he didn't ask her questions. She asked if he wasn't interested in why she wanted to travel. Servan sighed heavily and said that he would be lying if he said that he was not interested. He said that it was not something he needed to know. He looked at her intently and said that her safety and the fact that he was her doctor were the most important things to him. The young lady in turn thanked him shyly. She looked closely at the sprout and said that this place was visible from her window, and if she wanted to admire the tree that they planted together, then she could admire it at any time. She said steadfastly that it was a lot of fun and that it was now their memory. She said that she would like to see traces of everything she did with him every day. The young lady thanked him with a smile. He looked at her intently and said that he had said earlier that he would grow a tree for his lady, and his lady had planted a tree for him. Adelia looked at her companion with a smile. She was very pleased because he was telling her simply wonderful things. He looked at her intently and asked sheepishly if they could finish what they were doing. She agreed with him with a smile and also said that they could now leave as she knew that they needed to return to the barn and get the horse. The young lady looked at him in surprise and said excitedly that she could go herself. Servan looked at her intently and said that they could not go any further. He said that no matter how fast they went, they would not reach the nearest village until the morning. He walked away from her and told her to wait there while he pitched the tent. The young lady sighed heavily. She realized that she was only getting in the way. She really tried her best, but to be honest, she was incredibly tired. It was difficult for her to continue the trip. She sighed heavily because she realized that she could not even help him set up the tent. She looked at him intently and asked for forgiveness. She said that, unfortunately, she could not go alone. Straightening out the tent, he said that everything was fine, and she did not need to worry about such things, since he was very glad when she called him with her. He said that the fact that she had disappeared, leaving only a letter, would be even more painful for him. The young lady in turn smiled since she had left a letter, and in it she wrote that she had gone on a journey with him. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that he had finished smoothing out the tent, and she could come inside. The young lady asked in surprise, why so quickly? She went inside and noticed that it was very warm inside. He asked her to wait a little, as if she were to sleep in such a state, it would be very uncomfortable. He said that she could first wash herself in hot water and then lie down to sleep, as she would feel better that way. The young lady looked at him in surprise and said that they didn't have anything in order for them to get enough water. He said with a smile that he was making a bath for her now. The young lady was surprised because she didn't expect such a thing. She looked at him closely as she noticed that he had used magic. He smiled and said that he had added some essential oils and made the water hotter. He asked if the water temperature was right for her. The young lady slowly walked up and touched the water. She said with a smile that it was very good. She looked at him closely and said that, unfortunately, she had never taken a bath on her own. She said that until now, the maids had done everything, so she had not thought about it. She asked with a smile if he could help her take a bath. The young man froze in shock, as he had not expected to hear anything like that. The young lady looked at him intently. She was distracted and did not understand why he blushed so much. Since she was telling him everything seriously, she asked him with a smile to help her take off her clothes. She said that unfortunately she had never done it herself, but he should know how to do it. He looked at her confusedly, since he could not utter a word. A moment later, he said that dangerous monsters could appear at any moment, so he needed to protect her. With the speed of lightning, he ran out of the tent in embarrassment. The young lady, in turn, laughed because she saw that he was very cute. The young lady slowly stepped into the water. She said with a smile that the decision to wear simple clothes was the right one. She really liked the bath he had prepared for her. She wondered if it was worth using it every day. Stepping outside, the young man froze in shock. He sighed heavily. He was embarrassed and couldn't let her see his stupid expression. He didn't think about it at all, as he just wanted to help her relax. A moment later, he froze in place with alarm, as he heard and felt that someone had used magic. He knew that the wind was not natural at all, and that someone had caused it deliberately. He looked intently into the distance, because he realized that there was a fight going on somewhere. He understood that it had nothing to do with him. Unfortunately, he knew that his lady was very sensitive, and if someone made a lot of noise, then she would certainly find out about the fight. He wondered if he should go and check everything out. He froze in place as he saw the young people running towards him. A moment later, he saw 2 children and 2 men running after the children. He realized that the wind was created by the children to cover their tracks. A moment later, he saw the man use force on the children and direct a scorching fire. Unfortunately, the fire scorched the young girl. Her friend screamed and ran to her. With lightning speed, he used his magic and cooled her, burned her with water. The man screamed in rage at the children that they would be persecuted for the rest of their lives. The man directed a scorching fire at the children, but a moment later, someone stopped his attack. The young lady in turn became alert, as she realized that something had happened. She shouted into the distance and asked her companion as she was very worried. He sighed heavily, and looking at everything that was happening, told his companion that nothing special had happened. The man was trembling with fear as he understood that if the situation continued in this direction, he too would die at the scene of the battle. Servan looked at the young man closely, as he knew that if he let him go now, it could become a big problem in the future. With lightning speed, he used his power, and the man began to choke. A moment later, the man fell dead to the ground. Servan. She looked at the dead man and extinguished his magic. He knew perfectly well that it was better to kill him now. A moment later, he turned his gaze to the young boys. He was a little puzzled and wondered what he should do with them. He stared at them for a moment, wondering whether he should let them go or kill them. The young lady from the tent asked her companion what the alarming sound was she had heard. He calmly said that there had been a fight nearby. He understood that if he had touched the boy first, the girl would have started to resist, and this could have ultimately caused more noise. A moment later, he used his magic and hid the dead bodies. He glanced sideways at the children and told the young lady that he saw 2 children running towards them. The boy stared at the young man without making a sound. A moment later, the young lady came out of the tent and looked closely at her friend. She asked which children they were talking about. She looked sideways at the children and said that she smelled something burning. Servain P. looked at the young lady and said that she might catch a cold and that she needed to go into the tent. The boy looked intently at the young men and asked them for help. He said his sister had been badly injured. She'd been badly burned, and if things continued as they were, things would be very sad. He said that if they helped them, they would definitely repay them in the future for this service. A moment later, he fell to his knees and began to beg them for help. The young lady, in turn, looked closely at the child. She saw that their faces and hands were clean, and the magic stone he held in his hand was also unusual. She looked closely at the boy and wondered if these children were really trapped in a war for survival. She knew that they didn't look like locals and seemed to have fled here from another country. She didn't know if they were heirless nobles, as she didn't want to help them as those people had overcome her family. She knew that they had too easily abandoned their family, who had served the country faithfully, despite the fact that they had been captured and slandered. She knew that, with lightning speed, they had all turned their backs on them. Servan looked at the children intently and said that he was sure there was nothing wrong with them helping them. The young lady in turn looked at the children intently. Servan looked at the boy and said that he thought they would help them. Later looked into the boy's eyes and said that his eyes were not bad. Adelia glanced sideways at her companion. She knew that he rarely expressed his opinion with such confidence. She looked intently at the young man and said that there was no other way. The young lady said that they could go inside, otherwise they would get sick. She said that they would first treat the girl. The young man was surprised and very grateful to them for their help. The young lady slowly approached the boy and said with a smile that he did not need to worry since her companion knew how to heal people. She looked at him intently and said that he also needed to be treated, but in doing so, he needed to take off his cloak. The young man slowly began to take off his cloak as he was told. The young lady in turn froze in place in surprise. She looked at him intently and asked if he was from Airless. He looked at her intently and asked her in surprise how she knew about it. She looked at him with a smile as she saw that he was very cute and looked the same as when she joked with Servan. For a moment, but she thought about it and said that she just felt it. She said that the men in Airless mostly have short hair. She knew that he did not look like a noble at all. She said with a smile that he could relax, since the fact that he was not from this country. She was very pleased. He timidly asked if she would report them. He said that he might as well be someone who was not allowed to be there. Adelia looked at him intently and asked if he knew who she really was. He looked at her and said that anyone who had seen a teenage girl with pink hair would have thought the same as he did. She looked at him closely and said with a smile that he was very smart. She saw that he was a very clever boy, and at such a young age he had enough knowledge to distinguish noble families from other countries. She looked closely at the young man, as from his skin color one could tell that he was not from the northern tribes like Servan. She wondered if he was from a large aristocratic family in a small country nearby. She looked at him sharply and said that he was right in his judgments about who she was. She said that it would be right to report them, but now she was an ordinary traveler, so he did not need to worry. She looked at him with a smile and asked if he could keep their meeting a secret. He said that of course he would keep everything a secret, as he was not one of those who did not know how to repay such a big favor. Adelia said with a smile that she had already finished with the treatment so he could go to his sister. She looked closely at the young lady and said that she did not know whether it was because they were brother and sister or not, but they still looked very similar to each other. He looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if this was true. Adelia said that it was. Adelia was surprised, so she said that they were similar. She did not understand why he was so happy. She knew that it is natural for relatives to be similar to each other. The young man sighed heavily and said with a smile that fate really has no end. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. He said that he was an ordinary weak person who unfortunately could not protect himself, but still one day he would repay them for their help. He said his name was Hal, but unfortunately he couldn't say more now. He said with a smile that the next time they met he would tell her his real name. Adelia looked at him with a smile and said that she would look forward to their next meeting. And for now, he needed to grow and gain strength. Servar lay shocked and quiet next to the young lady. He was puzzled and did not understand how this had happened. He couldn't stand such closeness and slowly rose up. The young man looked at him intently and said that he had no dignity at all. He asked if he was not ashamed. Servan looked at the young man closely and used his magic. He asked if Hal would be ashamed in his place. Hal looked closely at the young man and said that, as expected, he was quite intelligent, since even the sound from outside did not penetrate into the tent. Hal said that there was no respect for him in that, because he simply hadn't expected that from him. so for a while he wondered if he was hurt. Servan looked at the young man and asked if he would stop pretending to be a child. Hal looked at him with a grin and said that he really was just a kid, since he was turning 30 this year. Hal looked at Servan intently, with a smile thank him, since he now had enough time. He used his magic and healed the young lady. Hal sighed heavily and said that, to tell the truth, he was not in the best shape right now. Servan looked at him in surprise and asked if it was all because of the girl. Hal looked closely at the young lady who was sleeping peacefully. He said that, as her brother, he could not do otherwise. Servant looked at him intently and asked if she was his sister. Hal sighed heavily and said that it was all true, but they were distant relatives, so they couldn't be considered brother and sister. Servant P looked at the young man and said that it seemed that he would be getting a mark very soon. He sighed heavily and said that he was sorry that he couldn't protect her when she was younger. He said that, although it would take time, he would definitely help her get back her destined place. Servan looked at the young man and said that if he was finished, he could leave. Hal looked at him and said that he was very harmful. He said that there were almost no Seligelians left and they should stick together. Hal sighed and said that his pursuers would be here soon, so it was time for them to leave. He slowly lifted the young lady into his arms and said with a smile that he also had someone he had to protect. A moment later, he said goodbye to Servan and slowly went on his way. The young lady, half asleep, opened her eyes and smelled a pleasant scent. She came out of the tent and asked her companion where the children were. He looked at her in surprise as he did not expect her to wake up so early. He looked at her intently and said that they did not want to disturb them anymore, so they left at dawn. She looked at him with a yawn and asked if it was true. She said that the young people were very mature and not at all like children. Servant looked at the young lady closely and asked if she liked the child. She said that the child did not look so dangerous, and it reminded her of Servant as a child. She said with a smile that she was just curious about where he came from. Servan sighed and said that he didn't know where he was from, but if she was so curious, he would ask him the next time they met. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked if they would really meet again. Servan looked at her intently and said with a smile that it was all so, since they would certainly meet again. Slaves and masters, he wanted to change this long-standing relationship. He did not plan to do something great at all, since it was only because he had always depended on another person. Now he wanted to help this person and did not want to be a burden for him. The young lady, in turn, sighed heavily and asked her companion why everything had turned out this way again. He smiled and said that he was not tired at all, so she did not need to worry, and it was not surprising that their physical capabilities differed. He smiled and said that she could rest for a while, but the young lady was alarmed as she was wasting his magical powers again. A moment later, he told her to look into the distance, as they had already arrived. Adelia said with a smile that the city was very crowded. He looked at her closely and asked if the walk was a burden to her. She smiled and said that everything was fine, since all she did was rest, and now she was much better. Servan was a little puzzled as he wanted to check out the surroundings, and so he got off his horse. He knew it would take some time to get the pass, and during all that time, the young lady might get very tired. He looked at her and asked if she could stay put while he went and got a pass. She looked at him and said that they should go together, because she had a family ring with her, so they just needed to show it. Servant S said that she should stay where she was while he did everything. The young lady was shocked and understood that he simply didn't care about his own life, since she knew that they hadn't figured out the mark yet. She insistently said that they would go together. She looked at him intently and said that if he still did not agree, then he needed to get rid of the mark that had been imposed first. She did not understand why he was so stubborn. A moment later, the young lady heard someone calling her. The young man looked intently at the young lady, and with a beaming smile, asked her if he could help her with anything. She froze in place as she realized that it was Huey himself in front of her crouch. The young lady froze in place in shock, as she never expected to find him so quickly. She was surprised because he even came to her himself. She did not expect at all that his generous person would deign to offer her help. She had no conscience at all, and she decided to pretend to be a child. She looked at him with a radiant smile and asked if he could help them. She knew that her childish appearance would be useful in this situation. He smiled and said that they seemed to be lost in such a crowd. He said that he would certainly help them. The young lady thanked him for his help. She saw that he was a very sweet, pure, and polite child. The young man was a little puzzled. He didn't understand why he felt so strange being around the little girl. He reached out to stroke her head, but Servanzi covered her with his body and grabbed his hand. He asked, puzzled, what the young man was doing now. Huey looked at them in surprise and apologized. He said with a smile that if they went with him, they would be able to pass the checkpoint. He smiled and said that he was a local resident, and since he traveled often and was on good terms with the guards, the young lady thanked him with a smile for his help. He said with a smile that there was nothing to thank him for, as he was very happy to help them. Huey was shaking with fear. He didn't understand why it was so cold. The young lady looked at the young man in bewilderment and said that she didn't feel the cold at all. Huey said in surprise that it seemed like he had caught a cold, and maybe next time he would need to wear warmer clothes. The young lady looked at the young man in surprise. She wondered if he had gone crazy. Servan looked sideways at the young lady, but said nothing. A moment later, he told the young lady that he would like to see the sea with her. He smiled and asked if she wanted to go fishing when it was all over. Adelia looked at him in surprise. He smiled and said that they could go boating, and he really wanted to do that with her. The lady froze in embarrassment, wondering if this was an invitation to a date. She said with a smile that she agreed with his proposal. At the checkpoint, the young lady showed her ring. Huey stood in surprise as he looked at the ring. He recognized who the ring belonged to and who the young lady really was. He was a little confused and didn't understand what she was doing there. Adelia looked at the young man with a smile and thanked him for his help. Huey greeted her in Gurten with a smile. He said that if they had time, they should definitely visit the market, since it was the most famous in these parts. Huey said with a smile that he hoped for the two of them, and that the sea god Bishan would bless them. He looked at them in surprise as they followed him closely. He asked if they wanted to go to the inn first. She said that they came there because they wanted to meet with the head of the Gallon Corporation. She looked at him with a smile and asked if he knew this man. He looked at her in surprise and said that they had come to meet his brother. He smiled and said that they should wait a little. Hui Pi ran closer to his brother and called him. The young man sighed heavily, looking at his brother, and said that he had already told him many times not to shout. The young man smiled, looking at his brother, and said that guests had come to see him. A moment later, the lady approached the head of the corporation and said with a smile that she was very glad that they were able to meet. She said with a smile that her name was Adelia Gerard. She immediately said that she would like to invest in their corporation. She asked with a smile if she could talk to him alone. The young man froze in shock as he realized who she was. He knew she was from an influential family. He was surprised that she wanted to invest in his corporation, as she did not specialize in the field that people usually invest money in. He thought that they knew that his corporation needed money, so they intended to take advantage of the situation and take over the corporation. The young lady looked at him intently and said that she did not want to take over his corporation at all. She looked at him with a smile and said that he most likely thought that since she came to invest, she would later take over the company. He looked at her intently and said that their corporation was not one that would attract her attention. He looked at her and asked what would happen if he suddenly refused her offer. She looked at him with a smile and said that with the current state of the corporation, it seemed difficult for him to make a decision. The young man, in turn, understood perfectly well that the young lady was right. Since managing the corporation was becoming more difficult every day, he said that he would not be able to return the full amount in the shortest possible time. A moment later, the young lady handed him the document and said that she was interested in Friend. He looked closely at the brochures that were distributed to find investors for the study. She said he must be very impressed that such a noble lady was interested in the study of food preservation. She said she really liked the goal of the project and that it could reduce the number of deaths from spoiled food. He knew that the reason this research was stopped was because the nobility was not interested in it, since they all have the money and influence to use preservation magic. Since the project did not attract attention, there was no investment from the nobility. Unfortunately, his corporation was having more and more difficulties. She knew that there were hungry children everywhere who were driven crazy by hunger. She knew that the brothers lost their parents in childhood and their sister died from poisoning. This wound made the two brothers dream of becoming doctors or scientists. The young man looked closely at the lady and said that the research had many goals. He was interested if she could name at least one of them that she decided to invest in. He said that she had clearly never eaten spoiled fish before. The young lady asked with a smile if it mattered. He looked closely at the young lady as he remembered his sister. He knew that if nothing had happened to her, she could have been the same age as the young lady. She looked at him intently and said that she just wanted to see the results of the study. She looked at him with a smile and asked if she could look at his results. Sometime later, Adlia visited the laboratory. She and her companions were surprised as everything was neatly folded in it. The young man smiled and said that this place was intended for storing things, and the laboratory was a little further away. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that he would now show her his first artifact. She looked at the item in surprise and said that it was very small. She asked in surprise why he used a first-level magic stone. He said that he did it because of its properties. He looked at her intently and said that he was still working on reducing the magic he consumed. Since the size of the first-level magic stone was a good fit, she said that this artifact was too big and also asked how she could use them. He looked at her intently and said that she called this artifact Priya. The young lady looked at him intently. She knew that their late sister's name was exactly that Priya Crouch. Adelia said that it was a very beautiful name because it meant joy. He looked at her intently and said that this was exactly it. She knew that, although he was very cold on the outside, but deep inside, he was a very sweet young man. He looked at her intently and said that it was a very beautiful name. The young lady looked at her companion in surprise and asked what he had found. Servan looked at her and said that the structure of these artifacts was very unusual. The young man said that this was the newest artifact, also the largest of the artifacts in existence. She looked at him sideways and asked if he often recharged them with magic. He said that in case the magic stone was damaged, they did not recharge them regularly. He looked at her intently and told her how much magical energy charge was needed for a week. The young lady in turn sighed heavily. She understood that if she recharged them so often, her magic reserve would be at 0. A moment later, she froze in place as she saw Rimla. He looked at her intently and said that everything was correct, as they had placed the plants there to get rid of the smell. He looked closely at the young lady who was fascinated by the find. He said that if there is a lot of food in a closed space, it will easily wither and absorb the smell. The young lady knew very well that this plant had a disinfectant effect. Elkari and Z became interested in the plant due to Huey's recommendation. She knew that if she brought Huey, the reason he created Rimla's field would disappear, because they couldn't deal with Gustia back then. She looked at the young man intently and said that she and the more important thing in this research is the magic stone and the magic used to charge it. He said that everything is exactly like that. It is easy to buy, but not charge magic stones. He sighed heavily and said that since the Yahi were senior staff, they were very difficult to recruit. Adelia asked if he really needed that much magic. He said that it was because it required continuous work to keep up with the progress and follow through. He said that he was the only one doing it now, so the research was progressing slowly. She looked at him with a smile and said that he just had to accept her conditions. She smiled and said that she would certainly provide them with magic stones and Yahi every month. He looked at her closely and said that, frankly, he would like to have them right now, but unfortunately, the price for them would be too high. She looked at them and said that one of her conditions was that he and the organization would go to her family. She said that she really hoped that they would settle on their land. He looked at her intently and said that he was perfectly happy with it, but he hesitated because he did not want to leave his native place. A moment later, the young people heard a very loud noise that startled them. Servan looked at them intently and asked for forgiveness. He said that he only wanted to know how much magic he could charge. He said that he did not know at all that he made such a noise while charging. The young man looked at the boy closely and said that wasn't true, as that level didn't usually produce such sounds. He said it was very strange. He was shocked as he noticed that his artifact was completely filled with magic. He looked at the young man in bewilderment as he knew that he had just dropped everything to 0. He wondered if the young man had broken it. He looked closely at the young lady and asked if his family really had that many mages of that level. He said that they could restore magic several times a day. Servan said that he could do it dozens of times. He was shocked because he realized that he had just found a gold mine. The young lady stopped him and said that these were her people. He looked at her intently and asked if he signed the contract. Could he borrow her people for research? The young lady in turn knew that her friend was just an exception, but she decided to take advantage of this advantage. She looked closely at the young man and agreed with him. She asked if he wanted to sign the contract right away. They signed a contract. The young lady knew that Crouch had to give her half of his artifacts and also pay a certain percentage of the investment amount. But if something went wrong and they could not pay the amount, then the younger brother would pay this amount. She knew that young people were very responsible, and if war broke out, they would come to her themselves. She knew that her younger brother would not be able to abandon the only person left in the city, and he would certainly be under her control. The young lady looked at her companion closely and said that he was probably tired today. She said that there was no need for him to follow her everywhere, and he could just go and rest. He looked at her and said that he was not tired, but he did not want to do anything that she did not want. She looked at him with a smile and said that they could finish tomorrow. Before she could finish her sentence, she tripped. Servant, with lightning speed, he picked up the young lady and gently hugged her shoulders. He asked excitedly if she was okay. Adelia, with a smile, said that she was okay, but perhaps she was very nervous today. He looked at her intently, but a moment later, he picked her up in his arms and asked for forgiveness. The young lady looked at him confusedly and asked what he was doing. He sighed heavily, and looking at the lady, said that she was very pale, and that was the reason he was worried. She sighed heavily and asked if it was too much, as she was not a child at all. He said sheepishly that she was the most important thing to him. The young lady was confused by his words, but at the same time, she was glad that he told her such a thing. She said with a smile that he could do whatever he wanted. The young man looked closely at the young people and said with a smile that it was very good that they came together. Servan looked at him intently and asked quietly where the young lady's room was. Ruth P. looked at the young man and said that his brother did not want to mix personal relationships with work, so he was kicked out. He looked closely at the young lady and asked how old she was turning this year, since he had a sister of the same age, Servan E. If she looked at the young man and said that he could not reveal personal information about the lady. Ruth asked for forgiveness, as he knew that she was the heiress of a large family. Servan looked closely at the young man and said that everything was fine, but next time he would hope that the young man would be careful. Ruth looked closely at the young man and timidly asked if the young lady really had speed. He asked if she was hurt or not, as her face was an unnatural color. He reached closer to her as he wanted to touch her face. Servan didn't like this at all, and with the speed of lightning, he used his magic. The young man quickly pulled his hand back and screamed he was shocked. He looked closely at his hand as he didn't understand what had happened at all. He noticed that it was static electricity. He was surprised as he hadn't even touched the lady. Servan P. apologized and said he had to go. The young man froze in shock. He stared after them and said he hoped to see them soon. Servan slowly walked up to the young lady's room. He was very angry and wanted to kill the young man. He growled angrily under his breath, as he was very angry that the young lady needed this young man. The young lady sighed heavily. She felt awkward. She looked into the distance in surprise and asked why she couldn't fish. Servant S. asked if she was hungry. He said that they could go to the market and buy some fish there. She sighed heavily and said that they couldn't do that because he hated the smell of fish, and she heard him constantly wrinkling his nose at the market. He looked at her puzzled and said that it was not that he hated her, but that his charms were a little more sensitive. She said that this was hatred because he hated her. He had to endure it. She said that when they were in the flower shop, he did not behave like that. Servan sighed heavily and said that he had simply come to terms with it because he loved flowers. He looked at her intently and said that it was she who had changed. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he meant. The young lady froze in place as she saw that she had come too close to him. The young lady froze in place with embarrassment. Adelia wondered if he had really taken such a small boat to stop at her. Servan looked closely at the young lady. He knew that the human psyche was very strange. He understood perfectly well that if she moved closer to him, then he would definitely lose his mind. He was puzzled because he knew that he was the first to take the initiative, and he had a lot of courage. A moment later, they heard fish biting. The young lady with the speed of lightning picked up the fishing rod and began to pull. A moment later, she pulled out a beautiful and large fish. Adelia was very pleased with herself. She shouted that she knew she would catch the fish faster than him. The young lady reached for the fish, but Servant O got ahead of her, and with the speed of lightning threw the fish into the boat. He said that he simply could not let it come into contact with her slippery body. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he wasn't using preservation magic. He looked at the lady intently and said that when he saved the fish, they would take it away. Since he had already filled the bucket with water, they couldn't use preservation magic on living animals. He looked at her intently and asked if they could go back. The young lady said with a smile that of course they could go back now, since the fish had already been caught. She was staring at the horizon, but later her gaze stopped on the young man. She froze in embarrassment, as his body was beautiful. The young lady in turn sighed heavily. She wondered why she now looked like a pervert. But in turn, she understood perfectly well that people should be honest with their desires. She looked at her dress in surprise as she had managed to get it dirty. Servant looked at the young lady with surprise and intently, for she seemed to him the crown of beauty. He looked at her intently and said shyly that now this is the only way back. She looked at him in surprise as she saw that he looked very happy. She had heard that he really enjoyed admiring nature, and he seemed to really enjoy the beach. She looked at him intently and asked with a smile if they should go to the beach again. Servan looked intently at the young lady, who looked at him with a radiant smile. He said with a smile that if he could, he would be very glad to go with her. He said that he would like to visit this beautiful place with her again. Sometime later, they went to the lands of Gerard. He looked at her closely and asked if they needed to go to the royal capital. He said that there should be a commotion there now. She said that they would soon hear news from the capital. She looked at him closely and asked if his body was okay, since he had used a lot of magic. Servan sighed heavily, but did not answer. After their trip together, he became more cunning, since he was no longer silent. He looked at her closely and said that he is also a human being, so he is a little tired, but still he is okay. She looked at him closely and said that he looks very tired. She said that he should tell her the truth, and he should be honest with her. Adelia looked at him and asked if she could pass on her magic to him. He froze in embarrassment. She looked at him closely and said with a smile that she had hardly used it, so if he wanted, she would help him. She was surprised, looked at him, and asked if he didn't like her idea. He said that he liked it. She looked at him intently and asked if he wanted to accept her magic. He looked away sheepishly and said that at the same time, he didn't know if he could do something like that, even though he tried his best not to become greedy. But she keeps doing this to him, and he just can't. She looked at him intently and said that she would certainly help him, but he could not accept other people's magic. With lightning speed, the young lady turned around and said that it was time for them to go. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was doing. Adelia P. came closer to him and, taking his hand, said that he was coming with her. She sighed heavily and told him that he needed to stop running away from her. He hesitated for a few seconds, not knowing what to do, but a moment later, he finally agreed with her. Hicks looked at the young people with fear. He froze in shock. The young lady looked at him with surprise and confusion, and a moment later said very loudly that she had previously told him not to do that. The young man was trembling with fear in the corner. Adelia sighed heavily and said that perhaps it was because she appeared out of nowhere. And unfortunately, people often do not understand this. She looked at him closely and asked if he wanted to get up. A moment later, he handed them the weapon he had made himself. She looked at the young man in surprise and asked if it was already ready. Servan looked closely at the package and asked what it was. The young lady looked closely at her companion and said with a smile that this was her gift for him. She said that he should open it immediately. He froze in place from shock as he did not expect to hear such a thing. Servant slowly and cautiously began to unwrap his gift. He froze in surprise when he saw the beautiful sword. A moment later, he said that the sword looked quite large. Hicks, surprised and puzzled, asked him what he meant. Hicks asked Servan if there was something he didn't like. He shouted that he had put his whole soul into this work of art. Servant looked angrily at the young man and said that this was too much. The young lady came closer to him as the master was very frightened. Adelia S. told her companion that he could tell her everything. She looked at him intently as she waited for an answer to the question. Servan sighed heavily and said that such techniques were against the rules. He sighed heavily, not knowing how to answer the question posed. For the heirless empire, other ludi were always considered inferior. For this reason, they were forced to become slaves. There were absolutely no exceptions anyway, and the slaves born from the Yahi were an example, since the Yahi became the strength of the country, and the nobles and royalty could not ignore this. After discussing this, they came up with another rule. They would be given the title of knight, for a short period of time, on the recommendation of those who held the title of count, or higher Yahi, were obliged to serve the person who recommended him as the king, and nobles could take away their titles at any time. Even if they were given the title of duke, they would still be looked down upon, and as they grew old and their strength weakened, they would become slaves again, like the beasts imprisoned in the impenetrable wall. Previously, he was content with the life of the beast, and said that he would not protest. He did not understand why the young lady was moving away from him. He sighed heavily, and said that he could no longer stay near her. The young lady looked at her companion in surprise, and asked puzzled what he meant. He said that if it was a magic stone, he could have it, but the sword was a great gift to him. He saw the sword with engraved on it the name of the god of war. He was very excited and did not understand who could give such a thing to a slave. He said that such a sword would attract attention. She looked at him in surprise and asked what the problem was. Servan said worriedly that they would misunderstand her intentions. Servan said that Airless had given a sword with the name of God engraved on it to those who belonged to the suppressed other people. He said that in this way they had to follow Hasidian and betray again and create Seligal. She looked at him intently and asked if he could do it. He looked at her in surprise and asked how he could cope with this. She looked at him intently and said that as long as he was not a slave, he should not stand behind her for no reason. She looked at him with a smile and asked if he would be on her side. He froze in shock, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. A moment later, he asked her in all seriousness if she really wanted to leave him. The young lady sighed heavily and said that it was true and she was very sorry. He sighed heavily as he now understood what it felt like to be abandoned. He was puzzled and didn't understand why she needed to carve the name of the god of war on the sword. He wondered what she really wanted. He sighed heavily as he knew that he probably didn't know her thoughts. He looked intently at Adelia and slowly walked towards her. A moment later, he said that if this is what she wants, no matter what it is, he will certainly follow it. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked why he was unfolding it if it needed to be wrapped. Servan sighed heavily and said that he was doing this because the floor was very dirty. She looked at him intently and agreed, and also told him to come to her. The young man in turn shuddered as he did not expect to hear such a things. She looked at him with a smile and said that he had worked very hard and that he should also lie down and rest for a while. She asked him with a playful smile for permission to transfer her magic to him. She said that even if she didn't have much of it, it was better than nothing. The young man in turn looked intently at the lady. He was very embarrassed by her words. He said that she didn't need to hold his hand at all. She looked at him with a smile and said that it would be more tiring than he thought. She asked if he would cry. He looked at her intently and said that he was fine, and also asked what about her. He asked excitedly if she would be okay. The young lady looked at him intently and said with a smile that he didn't have to worry at all. Adelia Fee took his hand and pulled him towards her. He froze as if he hadn't expected her to go on the offensive. She looked at him intently and with a playful smile said that now it was not he who was doing it, but she. Servant Z froze with embarrassment and almost fell from shock. He was very puzzled as he was very worried. She looked at him intently and with a soft smile said that when he was tired, he should tell her. She looked at him with a playful smile and asked if he understood her. He was very confused by her actions but still agreed. The young lady tenderly kissed his hand and passed on her magic to him. He was shocked as he had never experienced anything like this before. It seemed to him like a dream, and it vaguely filled his heart. He was very puzzled and understood that she needed to stop. Servan called Adelia tenderly. The young lady pulled away from him tenderly and asked if he was okay. She said his skin was so hard that she couldn't push her magic into it. She asked if she should try somewhere else. He looked at her confusedly and asked what she was talking about. The young lady in turn looked at him intently as she saw his emotions for the first time. She said she could try it on her neck. She looked at him intently and asked with a smile if he didn't mind. She wanted to know if he felt comfortable. Servan looked at her intently and said that he felt fine. Adlia, with a smile, said that in that case she could do it. She looked at him intently and said that she would try it on the neck this time. She slowly reached out to him. The young man froze in place from shock. The young lady, in turn, unsuccessfully moved towards him, as well as the body to kiss him. Servant D gave birth from embarrassment. He asked her to wait a little, but she did not listen to him. A moment later, she transferred her power to him. He was puzzled and did not understand what was happening to him. He wondered if his magical power was being restored. It seemed to him that the young lady gave him a lot of her power, but he no longer felt tired. He wondered if the amount of degenerate magic could be exceeded. With a trembling voice, he asked the young lady to stop. The young lady, in turn, looked at the young man with bewilderment. She did not understand why he was behaving this way. She pulled away from him, as she was very scared. She asked if he was tired. He looked at her with embarrassment, but breathlessly asked her to stop for today. She was surprised and looked intently at the young man. She saw his emotions and feelings of shamelessness. He was in shock and did not understand why he behaved like that in front of her. The young lady looked at him intently and said that she had given him a sword and magic. She looked at him intently and said in all seriousness that this did not mean that she wanted to leave him or that she wanted him to go away. She said that she is speaking now, and said earlier that you want him to stand not behind her, but next to her. She said she wanted to help him get back. The young lady looked at him timidly. She said that when he came back one day, she wanted him to live with her. He froze in surprise and, looking at her, asked what she was talking about. He asked, surprised and embarrassed, if he could really live with her. She asked if he really wanted to live with another girl. He answered embarrassedly that he didn't want that at all. He looked at her intently and said that the day she erased his mark would be the day he would have to leave. Adelia looked at him intently and asked if he wasn't going to wash it before he left. Servan said that was exactly it. The young lady looked at him intently. She didn't understand why he was so obsessed with this. She knew perfectly well that there was nothing good about it. Adelia looked at him intently and said with a smile that she agreed with him. She looked at him with a smile and said that in that case she would listen to him. The young lady looked at him intently and touched his face with a smile. She said that when it came to him, she was very weak. Servant took her hand tenderly and said that he would definitely return to her. He looked at her with an embarrassed smile and said that he would be on her side again. She smiled and said that she knew that he would definitely come back to her, and she would always wait for him. The young lady looked closely at her assistant and asked if he had told her father everything that had happened. He said with tears in his eyes that he had not told her anything yet, but the Count would be returning soon. He sighed heavily and said that unfortunately there was something more urgent than that. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. He said that their people heard that His Highness the Crown Prince had not woken up yet. He looked at the young lady intently and said that, for this reason, the messengers were very anxious to visit her, to find out what had happened to him. The young lady, in turn, was amazed by what she heard and asked if this was true. A moment later, she said that it had nothing to do with her. She asked her subordinate to tell them that the prince was struck by lightning. He looked at her with surprise and confusion and asked if she was really serious now. He sighed heavily and said that it all happened on their estate. That's why rumors spread like wildfire. But fortunately, no messenger had come yet. The assistant said that Hugh Crouch's equipment had already been transferred to the ship. She asked if there was any news yet. He looked at him intently and said that everything would be transported soon. He asked in surprise if she had really given the go-ahead for this. The young lady, with a sly grin, said that she had signed the contract. He looked at her intently and said that there was nothing urgent anymore, and she could rest. The young lady agreed with a smile and opening the door, she said that if there was nothing urgent, then she would take a short break. She said that he could come back and get to work. The assistant looked at her intently and asked her excitedly to wait. He said that she had received a letter from the Count. She looked at the assistant in surprise and asked if she had really received a letter from her father. She was surprised and did not understand why he had sent the letter so late. The young man looked at the lady intently and said that it was exactly so. A moment later, he handed her the letter. The Count wrote to his daughter that his plans had changed so he would be a day earlier than expected. The young lady looked closely at the letter. She saw that it was definitely written by her father. Since she would not confuse his writing style with anyone else, she said with a smile that her father was still alive. She really wanted to see him as soon as possible. Servan looked intently at the young lady and asked if she had called him. Alia was momentarily taken aback, as she had not expected to see him so soon. She looked intently at the young man. He looked at her with bewilderment, as he did not understand what was going on in her head. She came up to him and slowly stroked his head, and also asked him if he slept well last night and if he was tired. He sighed heavily and said sheepishly that he was not tired and also slept well. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that you will treat him well in the future, so he does not need to run after other girls. He said that he will not do anything like that. She looked at him with a smile and said that he did not need to be so shy at all. Servanar decided to change the subject of the conversation and looked at the garden with embarrassment. He said that she had previously said that she wanted a rod and a flower garden. The young lady sighed heavily and said with a smile that these things were useless. She had previously dreamed of having a garden because she was very lonely, so she thought that in this distant land, if she created a beautiful garden like other nobles, someone would come to visit her, despite the fact that she lived very far away. She sighed heavily, knowing that she had simply wasted money and time hoping for this nonsense. He looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she was okay, since she had always said before that she wanted to have something like this. She looked at him with a smile and said that it was simply pointless but growing. Rilma was much better. Adelia Wu pointed her friend in one direction and said that she would make a large training ground there. Since it suited her family better than a flower garden, she knew that it would only be a camouflage, since it would later become a place for military maintenance. She knew that after building this area, she would put magic stones on the ground so that in winter this area would not be cold. She knew that it would be better if she told them to remove the building in the area to prepare a shelter for the army. The young lady in turn understood perfectly well that this was a good idea. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really liked the gardens. She said with a smile that she liked it, but there were forests, so she didn't need a garden anymore. She said that she could sit on the porch and enjoy her tea. He looked at her intently and said that next time he would plant a beautiful flower tree for her. She looked at him sideways and said that he should plant only one tree. He looked closely at the young lady as he saw that she was embarrassed and moved away from her. He fought the desire as he wanted to bite her and devour her. He understood perfectly well that he could devour her completely, and even if it hurt her, it would be pleasant for him, Seiching. He wondered if he was going crazy. He looked closely at the young lady and asked in surprise, "What are the bags with this product for?" She looked into the distance and said with a smile that if this product is buried deep in the ground and the seeds are sown, then they will grow well. He looked at her in surprise as he saw only wormy pieces of wood and peas. She said with a smile that it was all true, and she had read about it all in the book, because when the peas grew up, they could plant them. But to tell the truth, she had not read it. She had known about it before going back in time. Servan looked at her and asked if they were really going to buy this product and plant Rimla. She said that everything was correct, and the large seeds should be buried deeper, and the small ones closer to the top. A moment later, the young man used his magic, and all the goods began to float in the air. The young lady in turn froze in place. She was amazed by his amazing magic. She looked at him with a smile and said that she should do the same. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really wanted to do it herself. Adelia S. said that was exactly it. The young lady was slowly planting the plant. Adelia smiled and said that she really loved to mess around with the earth, and she also had a lot of fun when they spent time together. Servan looked at her and said that when she was little, she loved to play with the earth. She looked at her companion in surprise and asked if it was true. He said with a smile that she even drew his face on the ground. She smiled and said that she remembered it. She looked at him intently and said that at that time she deliberately drew him ugly. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked if he had already managed to plant all the plants. She sighed heavily as she wanted to spend more time with him, but he was in a great hurry. She asked why he was in a hurry and said that he didn't have to hurry at all. Servan looked at her and said that they had already arrived. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment and asked who he was talking about. She froze in place. Although she did not turn around, she still knew who it was. A moment later, she heard a painfully familiar voice. Turning around, she saw her father. He looked at her intently and said that they had not seen each other for a long time. The young lady froze in shock on the spot for a few seconds. She was glad that he was still alive. Overjoyed, she rushed to her father and hugged him very tightly. Trembling, she said that she missed you very much. She could hardly hold back her tears. But a moment later, the young lady could not bear it any longer and burst into tears. The Count looked at his daughter and asked for forgiveness for making her wait so long. The young lady in turn cried quietly on his chest. She wanted him to stay with her longer. She froze as she felt embarrassed that she was crying in front of him. The young lady timidly pulled away from her father and asked if he would like some tea. He looked at his daughter with a smile and said that it was a very good idea. The young lady looked at her father closely and asked him with a smile if he liked the tea. He smiled and said that the tea was very good, and it seemed like her skills had improved. He sighed heavily and said that he was not a tea lover at all, but still, sometimes it was good to experience such moments. The young lady stood up and looking at her father said that she had something to tell him. He looked at her intently and said that he had already heard that she did a lot. She asked him in surprise if it was true. He looked at her and said that he heard about the blacksmith crown prince and also heard that she went on a trip for the Gallon firm. Adelia was surprised and wondered who told him everything. She looked at her father intently and asked if he really wanted to stop her. He said that he didn't want to do this at all, since she had her own path, and he had no right to stop her. The young lady stood frozen in place, not saying a word. She wondered if he ever cared about her. She looked at her father intently and asked what he would do if she said she did not want to be married to the crown prince. He looked at his daughter in surprise. He wanted to say something, but suddenly someone knocked on the door. He looked at his daughter in surprise and asked who it could be. A moment later, they were informed that a messenger had arrived. The Duke looked at them intently and said with a grin that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. He looked at them with a grin and said that he really hoped they both had received Judith's blessing. The young lady looked closely at the Duke. She understood that he was not an ordinary man at all. She was excited and did not understand what he really wanted from them. She understood perfectly well that she had not yet seen the order from the Emperor. She looked at the Duke with a smile and said that this was so, and they had not seen each other for a long time. She said with a smile that she wished him to receive a blessing from Hasidian. The Duke slowly tasted the wonderful aromatic tea. A moment after he tasted the tea, he choked. The young lady asked him with a smirk if he liked the tea. She said she was a little clumsy and wasn't sure if he would like the tea. She hoped he understood her with his generosity. He looked at her closely and said that the tea was not bad. The young lady was pleased with this answer. She noticed that he was adapting very well. The Count looked closely at the Duke and asked why such a busy man like him had come to his lands. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he had no choice, because His Majesty had ordered him to come here as an envoy. The Duke looked closely at the Count. He thought that he had forgotten his place, and it was very arrogant of him. The Duke had previously heard that the Count was planning to return tomorrow, but he did not understand why it happened that he arrived today. The Duke arrived today because he knew that the Count was absent. She looked at the Duke and said that he himself wanted to come here. The Duke looked at the Count intently and said with a grin that a man who was so far from the capital as he knew was quite a lot. The Count looked at him intently and said that there was always news in the capital about the border, and there was nothing connected with it that he did not know. The Count looked at the Duke intently and asked what the real purpose of his visit was. The Duke looked at the Count closely and said that he had intended to talk to them a little, but they seemed to be in a hurry. He said with a grin that the older people get, the more insecure they become. He sighed heavily and said that he was the grandfather of His Highness the Crown Prince. The Count looked at the Duke and asked if His Highness, as the envoy, could discuss this in private. The Duke looked closely at the Count and said with a smile that he could consider this as the old man's disobedience. The Duke looked at the young lady intently and said that he really wanted the young lady to get engaged to His Highness as soon as possible. Adelia froze in place, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. The Count looked intently at the Duke, and the Duke in turn said with a grin that he did not understand what the Count meant. The Duke looked closely at the Count. He saw that he valued his daughter very much. The Duke said that the young lady was still young, and therefore he understood why the Count had avoided this conversation many times. The young lady in turn was very surprised, since she had not previously known that her father was, and was now against this marriage. Adelia thought about it, because in the past, her father asked about her wishes. She simply agreed to this marriage, and her lover left. She thought that she would never see him again, and then she had no feelings for the prince. She understood that there was nothing better than to tie the knot with the princes, but nevertheless their marriage was without love. She chose this path to make her father's time easier. She knew that he had never refused any of the emperor's orders. She was surprised and did not understand why he had acted differently this time. The Count looked at the Duke intently and said that his rejection of the Crown Prince's letter was not only for this reason. He said that since ancient times, his family had truly served the imperial family, and they could not be close to the emperors. The Duke looked at the Earl and said that the times are changing. He said that their land is the largest in the country. He looked at the young lady and asked what she thought about it. He said that she was now 19 years old, and it was high time to think about marriage. She looked at the Duke intently and said that she had always been raised as a descendant of this line, and that she should lead the family. She looked at the Duke intently and asked with a smile how she could leave her family to enter the palace. The Duke looked at those present in surprise and asked with bewilderment what was wrong with the two of them. The Duke sighed heavily and said that she could leave her inheritance to her relatives, since these are very difficult times, and His Highness needs great strength. He said that these are such difficult times, and their family should help the royal family. The Count looked at the Duke intently and said that it was not because of His Highness, but for his sake. He asked if His Highness's decree mentioned this. The Duke looked closely at the Count. He was furious because he saw that he was generally invulnerable, since he even noticed the Emperor's suspicious attitude towards His Highness. As the heir to the imperial throne, he was not supported, even though he was the Emperor's eldest child. He knew that you were in such a situation. His Highness's position was unstable. Even the crowd made a noise because he was struck by lightning. The Duke was puzzled and did not understand how this could happen. The Count looked at the Duke intently and said that he did not want his daughter to live in the palace at all, since everyone there was obliged to be careful with their words and steps. He said that if this was not included in the decree, then he would personally speak to His Majesty. The Duke sighed heavily and said that in the decree, His Majesty only ordered a thorough investigation into the incident. He asked if he could stay here and continue the investigation. The Duke said that it would not take long. The Count looked closely at his companion and said that he could stay in the estate as long as he wanted. The Duke looked at them with a grin. He wanted to see if they would change for me in a short time. He thanked them with a grin. He looked at them closely and thanked them for the favor they had given him. But in turn, he wondered how long this arrogant attitude towards them would continue. The young lady, with the speed of lightning, plopped down on the bed. She was very angry and did not understand what kind of treacherous men surrounded her. But a moment later, she heard someone calling her. The young lady froze for a moment as she saw her lover, who was in the window. He looked at her in surprise and asked worriedly if something was wrong. The young lady sighed heavily. She looked at the young man closely and said that the old man who came this time was the prince's last grandfather, and he was probably using this as an excuse to blame her. She said that she had nothing to do with it at all, and he was just unlucky to be struck by lightning. She did not understand why the Duke wanted to get to the bottom of the truth. Servan P. looked at the young lady and asked if the prince had not yet woken up. The young lady in turn said that he was still sleeping, and if he died, then their affairs would be bad. He looked at her intently and said that, in that case, they could wake him up. She looked at him in surprise as she did not understand what he was talking about. Servant S said that he had already seen a similar case. She was surprised and did not expect to hear something like that. She slowly took his hand and placed it on her shoulder. She said that they could end this. She looked at him intently and said that she knew for sure that he would cope, but she was still very worried about him. He looked at her intently and said that he would be fine, so she didn't need to worry about him. Servant S told the young lady that if anything went wrong, he would run away immediately. The young lady in turn understood perfectly well that this was not true, but still agreed with him. The maid slowly closed the door to the hut and sighed heavily. Servan looked at her closely and calmly asked what she was doing. Since she was in his hut, the maid screamed as she did not expect anyone to approach her. She fell to the ground from fright. She was trembling with fear, looking at Servan. She said that he scared her. Servan walked over and picked up the sword that the maid had taken from his hut. He looked intently at the maid and asked if she was really going to steal his thing. The maid looked at him intently. She was trembling and could not utter a word. He gave her a cold look and asked angrily if there was something wrong in his room. The maid knew that she shouldn't be afraid of him. She knew that he was always angry, no matter how people treated him. She casually and angrily asked if she really had to explain everything to him. She said that she just decided to see if everything was okay. He looked at the maid intently and with surprise, and asked what she had to do with his room, and he also showed her the sword and asked if she knew what it was. She looked closely at the young man, but unfortunately she had no idea what he was holding in his hands. She looked closely at the package and felt that someone had used magic on the package. Although she was about to check the sword, it was still wrapped in cloth. She only brought it because it looked very suspicious. She stood up slowly, shaking the dirt off her clothes. She said she couldn't have known about it. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she brought him here. The maid slowly walked closer to him and asked if he really wanted to know. She looked at him with a playful smile and asked his permission to tell him everything. She looked intently at the young man and began a conversation about his relationship with the young lady. She slowly snuggled closer to him and said with a playful grin that she wasn't the only one who doubted their relationship. She said with a grin that she went into his room. But unfortunately, she did not have time to finish her sentence, when suddenly the height flew up and began to choke. Trembling with fear, she asked him to stop. She could not breathe normally. He looked at her with contempt and asked if she had done anything. A moment later, he looked at her with fury and asked if she had done something to Adelia. The young man looked at the Duke and said that the girl was dead as she had slipped and fallen to her death. The Duke sighed heavily and said that the woman was still useless. The Duke in turn wondered if the Count could have killed the girl. He did not know if the Count could have found out that she was their spy. The Duke in turn thought that they might not have known who Greta was and what exactly he wanted to do with her help. He was a little surprised and puzzled as he did not understand why he was so angry. The Duke sighed heavily and looking at his assistant asked, "What about the magic stones?" And he also wanted to know if the young man had already contacted Sonia. The young man said that he had contacted her through the squad. The young man was a little excited. He said that they say that mining such stones is rare, and therefore it is difficult to do it right now. The Duke in turn understood this perfectly well. The Duke looked at the young man closely and said that even if he had to shift this responsibility to someone else and spend a lot of money, he had to find them. He asked the Duke about the prince's stay with the lady, whether they needed to conduct an investigation among the Arabs of Senegal. He thought for a moment, knowing that the young lady had turned her back on the crown prince for a lowly slave. The Duke sighed heavily. He knew that they first met when she was 9 years old, and the lady paid a lot of attention to him. He was a little agitated and said that, unfortunately, there were no more rumors. But despite everything they had to bring the young lady together with the prince, he thought for a moment and said that first he would have to meet with the head of the squad. He looked at his assistant and said that he would soon return to see the Count, and that it was necessary to contact the Count and invite him to dinner. The young man said that he understood everything and would immediately carry out the order. The Duke in turn sat quietly and pondered the situation. Hicks looked into the distance and called out to the young lady. He did not understand when she was going to leave, as they had decided to go in the morning. Servan looked at the young man intently and said that the lady had already given him a job. Hicks shuddered because he did not expect to hear Servan. Servan looked at the master and asked what he had forgotten there. Hicks screamed as he was very scared of the young man. A moment later, he was shaking with fear and said that he didn't want anything at all. With the speed of lightning, he said that it was time for him to leave and quickly ran away. Servan thought for a moment because he knew that he should not idle. Now he was puzzled and did not understand the essence of this matter. He understood that the maid Greta did not know anything. He had put time and effort into it, but unfortunately, he still hadn't figured anything out, which really irritated him. A moment later, he heard some noise in the distance. The Duke shouted angrily at the cat because he did not want to get out of the way. He looked at the servants and told them to get him out of the way at once. Servan looked intently at the Duke, who was very angry at the animals. At that moment, several thoughts flashed through his head. He was puzzled and did not understand why everything had suddenly changed so much. He did not understand who had given the sudden order. He looked closely at the Duke and thought that all this could have happened because of the unexpected appearance of the Duke, who was now called the messenger. Servan knew very well that the Duke was not the most powerful, so he knew that everything was fine. Servan knew that the Duke deserved to be punished for the damage he had done to the young lady's mood. He had used his magic. He understood that what he had done to the prince was not good, and he should avoid dangerous places. He wanted to have a little fun with him before his death. He used his magic on the cat in the blink of an eye. The cat growled, looking at the Duke. It was the roar of a lion. The Duke looked at the cat in surprise and asked with bewilderment what was wrong with him. The Duke said angrily that he would deal with the cat himself, since no one could do anything with him. He angrily took the bow and pulled the string. The Duke looked at the cat with fury. He said angrily that a bug like a cat did not dare to anger him. A moment later, a year later, he jumped on the Duke and hissed with fury. The horse was very frightened and reared up. The Duke was in shock. The young man entered the Count's office and called him in a hurry. He looked at the Count and said excitedly that the Duke had unfortunately fallen from his horse. The young lady looked at the Duke with surprise and tears in her eyes and asked how he managed to fall off his horse. She said that, although the doctors say it will be more difficult for him to walk, she is sure that he will recover quickly. The Duke is puzzled. He said that he himself hopes so. Adelia said with tears in her eyes that she would pray for the goddess of peace to protect him. She looked at them closely and wished them a good journey, and also told the Duke to be careful on the road. The young man looked closely at the young lady and smiled shyly. He saw that her mood had improved. The Count slowly approached him and called Servani. He understood perfectly well that there were only two people he could not kill. The first person was, of course, the second person was the one who introduced him to Adelia. Kelson Gerard looked closely at the young man and asked if he was busy. Servain said that of course he was not busy, and also asked the Count if he really needed anything. Looking at the Count, he remembered their first meeting. Then he did not have any special feelings. At that time, he was sold as a slave for fighting. The Count looked closely at the young man and said that he had good eyes. The Count looked at the young man and said that he would go with him than servant. It made no difference whether to stay there or to go with someone, so he obediently followed the Count. And then he met a young lady. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he was really the slave that his father had taken. She looked at him intently and began to bombard him with questions. Servan understood perfectly well that the answer to all his questions was her. Since then, he was connected by this red thread of fate with the young lady. Servan knew that thanks to the Count, she was born into the world, and also thanks to him, he met her. For this reason, he felt grateful to the Count. The Count looked closely at the young man and said that he had something to say. The Count asked him if he would like a cup of tea. The young man looked at the Count in surprise, since they had never drunk tea before, but the Count said that he had heard everything correctly. Servan agreed, and they went into the house. The young lady walked and wandered around the priest with revenge. She did not understand where her friend had gone. She looked around the area in surprise, looking for him. The young man looked intently at the young lady. He approached her and asked if she was looking for Servani. The young lady entered her father's office. He looked at her intently and asked if she had come to find that man. Adelia said that she had. and she had heard that her father had taken him away. The Count looked at his daughter intently and said that he was sending him back to her. He looked at her puzzledly and asked what she was thinking. He asked if she was really more worried about the guy than about her father. The young lady sighed heavily and said that was not the case at all. The Count said that the young man was still young, as he was only 18 years old. The young lady sighed heavily and said that compared to her, he was still a boy. She asked her father if there was anything else she could say. He sighed heavily and said that there was nothing more. The young lady looked at her father intently. She knew he didn't want her to know. She looked at her father intently and asked shyly if he knew that Servan liked her. The Count sighed heavily and said that he knew about it. Adelia looked at her father intently, but a moment later her expression changed and she looked at him with a smile. She told him with a smile that next time he could also invite her, and the three of them could have tea together. The young lady left, and the Count was left alone in the room. He sighed heavily, and tears began to flow from his eyes. He sighed heavily and asked God for forgiveness. Adelia sighed heavily. She was very angry and did not understand why he had not appeared yet, since she had searched the entire castle and could not find him. Adelia understood that if you don't find him today, then maybe they won't see each other for 4 years. She was very upset because she understood that she would not be able to see his beautiful face all this time and would not be able to hug him and smell his wonderful scent. She understood that of course they would meet before dawn, but they would have very little time. She put it off until today because she hated saying goodbye. A moment later, he finally called the young lady. She looked at him in surprise and asked how long he had been standing on the terrace. He looked at her intently and said that he had been there all this time, since he could not enter without her consent. She sighed heavily and said that he could come in. Servan looked at her intently and asked her puzzled why she was crying. He slowly approached her and asked in surprise if something had upset her. Coming closer to her, he saw a suitcase in the corner that was packed. He was upset but looked at the young lady and said that it looked like he had to leave today. He looked closely at the young lady because he knew perfectly well that leaving this man would hurt more than a wound to the bone. She came closer to him and asked for forgiveness. He looked at her intently and said that this was the promise he gave her, and she did not need to apologize at all, since it was he who chose this path. The young lady hugged him tightly and asked for forgiveness again. He was embarrassed, insisted, and tenderly hugged the lady. He understood that her traces had been with him for 10 years. The young lady in turn slowly used her magic to remove the seal. A moment later, the slave brand was destroyed. He looked at her intently and said that he would definitely come back because he was just a pathetic boy. And he would come back to her like a dog. He would come back to be near her. She looked at him intently and said that she liked him very much. He looked at her in surprise, as he knew that the secrets he kept in his heart were harder to hide than he thought. He looked at her intently and said that she was his only lady. He looked at her intently and said with an embarrassed smile that he had always kept love for her in his heart. She looked at him with a smile and said that he could call her by her first name. Servan looked intently at the young lady and with an embarrassed smile tenderly called her name. Adelia looked at him and said that in general, she hated removing the seals, but she had to do it. She asked for forgiveness for the pain she caused him. She came closer to him and said that she would leave a seal on him herself and show him what seal he would leave on her. The young lady slowly touched his lips. She asked with a smile if he wanted it. He looked at her shyly and said that he would like it. Some time later, the young people were engaged in a passionate kiss. He looked closely at the young lady and timidly asked if he could try it himself this time. She looked at him in surprise and with an embarrassed smile asked if he really wanted to try. A moment later, she said that he could do it. He pulled her closer to him and quietly whispered that he was very happy. She looked at her lover with a smile and tenderly said that he could call her by her name. Servan looked at her with embarrassment and sent her by her name. He said he hoped she could feel it. The young lady froze, looking at him. A moment later, she looked at him with a radiant smile and said that he was right. He sheepishly said that he kept a piece of her for himself. He asked her to do the same. She tenderly touched his hand and with a smile said that he should call her by name. She looked closely at her lover and said with a smile that this was just an exchange of magical power. She said that he should wipe away this sour face. The young man's expression sank as he felt guilty. The young lady, in turn, was extremely exhausted as she had received too much magical power. She said with a smile that he didn't need to apologize to her at all, as he had simply approached the matter with all seriousness. She smiled and said that he didn't force her to do it. She asked with a smile if he understood what she meant. Adelia asked shyly if he was sure that he had left a part of himself in her. The young lady, in turn, was very happy and was filled with happiness. He looked at her closely and said that she needed to have a very good rest. He also said that she should remember that she should not eat a lot of ice in hot weather, and she should not walk in the rain or cold wind. He said that she should take care of her health. The young lady, in turn, looked intently at her lover and said with a smile that he should not be sick and should not be hurt. She looked at him intently and said that he must certainly take care of himself. The young man, in turn, was very puzzled and upset, since he did not want to leave at all for the reason that he still had not caught the man who tried to kill the young lady. There were many doubts raging within him, and the thought of leaving was hateful to him. The Count looked at the young man closely and said that he understood perfectly well that he was worried, but he still had to trust him. Servan was a little surprised and worried. He knew that her father was pushing him as if he had already made a decision. He understood perfectly well that he had to leave her. Servan looked at Adelia and asked in all seriousness if he could come back and they could stay together. She looked at him with a smile and said that his place was next to her. He sighed and said that he would definitely return to her. He knew that even if he lost his legs, he would use his hands. If he was left without them, he would use his whole body. Even if his body remained lifeless, his soul would find a way. No matter what, one day he would return to her. He understood perfectly well that one day he would be next to her. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that it didn't matter at all when he returned to her. She smiled with tears in her eyes and said that she would always wait for his return. The young man sighed heavily, looking up. He said that anyone looking at this anomaly might think that it was a firework. He looked around because he was alarmed. He wondered where the fire came from. He sighed heavily, looking at the night. He said that usually he didn't care about others. The night did not answer, and an incomprehensible silence reigned between them. He looked closely at the young man. Because he was a little puzzled by his behavior, he knew that he was not human. He wondered if the young man was behaving like this, and if it had anything to do with that person. He froze looking at the young man as he seemed very angry. The young man sighed heavily and said that it all turned out to be because of the princess's handkerchief, as it was all covered in blood. He looked closely at the young man, since he carefully kept this scarf. But unfortunately, he did not know the owner of this scarf. He understood that looking at the material of this scarf, he could say that its owner was a girl of noble blood. Although he didn't know what kind of relationship there was between a noblewoman and a born slave, he still called that girl a princess. The young man looked at him intently and asked how long he was going to refuse the crown prince's request. He asked Servan if he was afraid that this could turn into a big problem for him. The young man told him that until now, he had been using the excuse that he was still a child. But now that he was an adult, the young man asked him what he would do next. He looked at him intently and asked how many goodies the nobleman would receive. Servan sighed heavily and said that he hated shackles at all, because he loved freedom. The young man looked at him intently and said that he was different. He told Servan that he was not like everyone else. He did not understand at all how he could fall in love with someone, since he saw only thorns around him. Servan, in turn, did not want to continue such a dialogue any longer. He turned around to leave him. The young man, in turn, was agitated, but shouted to his friend that he did not mean this and asked him to wait. The young man looked at his friend with surprise and confusion and asked the reason for his refusal. He asked if it was all because of that person. The young man told Servan that he was from Airless and that the relationship between Airless and Ellen was strained. He said that he was very interested in all of this. A moment later, the crown prince approached them and, looking at Servan, asked if he was really doing it. Because of Adelia, Gerard refused his request. The young man stepped aside and became lost in his thoughts. Meanwhile, Servant S greeted the crown prince with all due courtesy. He looked closely at the crown prince and blessed him with the god Judas. The crown prince looked at the young man intently and said that this was very boring. He told Servan that he knew very well that he had not come for this conversation. The prince looked at the young man with a smile and said that he could stop pretending that he didn't know. The prince looked at him intently and said that he had already found out everything, but the young man in turn looked intently at the prince and did not answer. The prince told him that the fact that he had put so much effort into it certainly spoke to the importance of the matter. The prince asked the young man if he would like to listen to him. Servan looked intently at the prince and said that he wished to listen to him. The prince said with a satisfied smile that he would finally be able to have a glass of alcohol with him, slowly approached the young man and said with a grin that this would be interesting. Servant. With the help of the crystal, he saw the young lady. He looked closely at the prince and asked what was written on this piece of paper. The prince said with a grin that there was written about the young lady's engagement. It had not yet been made public, so even he had a hard time getting this information. The crown prince looked at the young man intently and said that the young lady was in engagement negotiations with the crown prince of airless country, and the crown prince was courting her unilaterally, but the duke and his arrogant daughter were not well disposed towards him. The crown prince looked closely at the young man and asked with a grin how long he thought this would last. The crown prince said that the duke was a very greedy man, and he really wanted to make his daughter the crown prince's concubine, and he was also the crown prince's grandfather. The crown prince looked closely at the young man and asked if he thought that the duke would not want to become the emperor's father-in-law. The crown prince looked at the young man intently and said that the moment the little one grew up and became empress, the young lady would say goodbye to her life. The crown prince told his friend that despite everything, he also grieved for his love. The crown prince understood that Servan had not harmed her empire, but had merely fallen madly in love with a young lady. But those people wanted to hurt her. The prince knew that Servan's enemy was Airless, not Elaine. He looked at the crown prince intently and asked how he could trust him. The prince looked at the young man in surprise and asked if he really suspected him of lying. The prince said that, unfortunately, he had not thought at all that the young man was such a poor judge of character. Servan looked at the prince intently and said that he would like to ask for irrefutable evidence. The prince looked at the young man with puzzlement and asked what he would do if he said no to this request. The young man looked intently at the prince and said that he would definitely leave this place. He said that if he wanted to escape, no one could stop him. The prince looked at the young man intently. He was very puzzled, as he had expected it to be difficult, but he was very irritated by him. The prince understood that, in fact, the young man was right, since he could easily leave if he wanted. After all, he was the strongest of all. He had incredible talent, and the prince spent years to get it. The prince understood perfectly well that in order to achieve his goal, he really needed such a strong person. The prince sighed heavily and told the young man that he had won, and he would do as Servan wanted. Servan with anger, and said that he was infuriating him too. He said that Servan had been working all this time without a break, and the people in the squad nicknamed him the Devil. Servan looked at the prince in surprise and said that it sounded cruel, since he was not an evil man at all. The prince looked at the young man in surprise and asked if he really believed it. Servan looked at the prince and said that he would call himself something else. Servan said he was Hasidian, the god of war, because that sounds much better. After talking with the prince, the young man left to be alone. A moment later, he used his magic. With the help of his magic, he saw his young lady. He looked closely at her reflection. Servan looked at his beloved and wondered if he was doing the right thing. He understood perfectly well that he did everything for her sake. He was a little worried and did not understand why she looked so exhausted. Looking at her, he wondered if she was tired. He knew perfectly well that one day he would be next to her again. He remembered how she told him with a smile that it didn't matter when he returned to her, she would always wait for him. A moment later, he sat down with a thud on the ground and thought about the situation at hand. He really hoped that she was safe now. Servan sighed heavily as he missed her to death. The young lady looked out the window and thought for a moment. The count looked at his daughter and called her. He asked excitedly what she was thinking about so intently. The young lady in turn sighed heavily and said that the night sky reminded her of Servant. She said that he should be an adult by now, and she was very worried about how he was doing. The Count looked closely at his daughter, but said nothing. A moment later, he said that she could look at this situation from a different angle, since Selegalek was considered an adult at the moment he became a military man. So he stopped being a child at the age of 8. The young lady sighed heavily, and looking at his father, asked how they could call such a little boy an adult. She said that at that time, he was shy and silent. The Count, in turn, realized that the young man was simply a cunning boy. The young lady, in turn, laughed heartily. She looked at her father and said with a smile that he would be very surprised if he looked in the mirror. She said that she should have saved his expression in the magic stone. She was very happy as she and her father had become very close and often had tea parties, and they began to express affection for each other more often. She looked at her father with a smile and said that when the young man returned, they should all have tea together. He looked at her intently and said that it was already late and he would go first. The young lady laughed and went up to Father P and kissed his cheek tenderly. She wished him good night. The Count walked a few steps and began to cough heavily. He looked closely at his hand and saw blood on it. He knew that he had already died once, and then the fairy came to find him. She looked at him intently and said that he would listen to his wish and also listen to his daughter's wish, since this was their vow. He knew that caring for people and protecting them was their destiny, and it was also their mission for those with fairy blood in their veins. The Count, in turn, understood perfectly well that they were given only one chance. They could get this chance when they faced betrayal by people. She looked at him intently and said that she would certainly fulfill his wish, but he would not be able to observe or interfere. She looked at him hard and said that he would not be there. She asked him if he understood that he looked at her hard and said that if that was the price he had to pay, then he would gladly accept it. The fairy looked at him with tears in her eyes. She cried and said that this was his original oath, and she heard what he wished for. She looked at him intently and said that the studio here, she swears that his wish will certainly be fulfilled. After some time, a war broke out between Airless and Elaine. Elkarion tried to send Kelsian to the battlefield, but he could not. It was all because Kelsian was dying. The young lady looked at her father with tears in her eyes. She was in shock and begged him not to leave her. The Count looked intently at his daughter, but said nothing. He wanted so much to see himself holding her hand tightly, but it seemed he wanted too much. He swore to her that her wish would be fulfilled. The Count looked intently at his daughter and said with a smile that he loved her very much. The young lady, in turn, looked intently at her father and cried. He looked at her and with a gentle smile said that she would definitely be happy. She was surprised, looked at him and called, but he had already left her. She knew that her father had left her, and now she was faced with many difficulties. Time flew by again, but he had no regrets about disappearing from his daughter's life. Some time later, the lands of Gerard fell at the hands of Elaine. For the past decade, the powerful magic of the ancients was lost, and still no one entered through the gates of Gerard, but still the commander of Elaine's army, Servan Hasadian, succeeded. The young lady's assistant rushed into the room and said loudly that Elaine's soldiers had entered the capital and they must flee immediately. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she would not leave this place. She looked sideways at the assistant and asked if they would spare her since she was a lord. She said that she was wrong from the very beginning. The young man was shocked and shouted at the young lady that now was not the time for this. Adelia knew perfectly well that none of the Gerards had died, and perhaps Servan had not allowed this to happen. But the truth was that even in her mind there was a tiny doubt. She understood perfectly well that her father's death had changed everything. She wondered if everything could ever be the same again as it was when her father was still alive. She sighed heavily as she wanted to give him a feeling of comfort in the estate. For this reason, she made him a shirt. She missed him very much and wondered when he would return to hers. She looked intently at the door and said that if he did not come back, she would go after him herself. The young man ran from the estate as fast as he could, but a moment later, someone grabbed him by the collar and pulled him. The young man fell to the ground with a crash. He was furious and did not understand how they could do such a thing to the Gerards. He looked at Servan in shock, rage, and contempt for the young man raging within him. He slowly walked to the door as he remembered that the young lady had told him that she did not care at all when he returned. She would always wait for him. He sighed heavily as he understood perfectly well that he should not have appeared before her in such a state. The young man looked closely at his friend and asked what he was standing there for. He asked the commander if he was really not thinking of entering the rooms. "Servant!" I looked askance at his friend and asked if he could smell blood. The young man looked at the commander in surprise. Servan began to sniff himself, as he knew that the young lady did not like the smell of blood. He thought that he should have bathed first. The young man laughed hysterically, as this was the first time he had seen his commander like that. He looked closely at the commander and said that he was fine and that he had no need to worry. At that moment, memories flashed past him. He glanced sideways at the commander and asked what he had in his hands. He was surprised and asked the commander if he had really brought the flower with him. He saw that the flower was protected by magic. He would have liked to touch the flower, but Servan did not allow him to do so. Servan knew very well that it was impossible to damage a flower if it had protective magic on it. The young man looked closely at the commander. He saw his careful touches. Also in his eyes there was a raging nostalgic rage in them. The ordinary cruelty was not visible. The young man looked intently at the door where the young lady was. He understood that she was that very flower. He saw a young lady who rushed into the commander's arms. With a smile on her face, he realized that she was that very flower. Servan was surprised, as he did not expect such a reception from the young lady. The young man slowly walked away from the lovers, as he felt like a third wheel in life. She looked at him closely and said with a smile that he had grown a lot and had become even taller than he had been before. She looked at him closely and said that his face seemed to have become quite thin. The young lady asked her lover if he had slept poorly. Servan, in turn, looked worriedly at the young lady and said that she looked very exhausted. He asked how she felt. Adelia looked at him intently and said with a smile that she was fine, and she was very glad that he was here next to her now. Servan was very puzzled as he saw that the young lady said that she was fine, but he knew that her father had only recently left her, and she had already suffered a lot. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she was walking barefoot and in cold weather. He was excited because he saw that her legs were red. He didn't understand why she was wearing such light clothes. A moment later, he picked her up in his arms. He looked at the young lady intently and quietly said that he had betrayed the Gerards and her as well. The young lady looked closely at her companion and asked if he had killed her people on the way here. She asked if he had destroyed her castle. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Adelia looked at him in bewilderment and asked what betrayal he was talking about. She looked at him with a smile and said that he should come to her. She asked if he remembered the words she had said. She looked at him intently and said that no matter when he returned, she would always wait for him. She said that all he had to do was come back to her. He did it, and she couldn't have dreamed of more. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she didn't curse him. He asked why she didn't blame him for anything, why she didn't burn with hatred towards him. The young lady thought for a moment. She said that she knew she shouldn't say this, but she was the heiress of the family. She said that maybe he wouldn't understand, but she didn't like heirless from the beginning. She looked at him intently and said that if she compared countries, she would prefer. Elaine Servan looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She looked at him with a smile and said that she should thank him for the destroyed lands, and now she could escape from the estate. She said that even if she loved her country, she still would not hate him, since she loved him very much. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that he could kiss her if he wanted. Servanzi froze in shock and embarrassment. The young lady looked at him intently and said with a smile that she could give him something better. The young lady slowly woke up and saw that it was still night. She looked around carefully, as she did not see her lover near her. He looked at her intently and asked if she was awake. Young Lady Z stood frozen in bewilderment. She looked at him intently and asked what he was doing in the dark on the ground. She did not understand why he was kneeling. He said guiltily that she had a high fever. She looked at him in surprise and said that it seemed he was right. She said that she felt like she had a really bad sore throat. The young lady looked at her lover tenderly and said that she could give him something better. She looked at him intently and said that he could not hold back. Adelia S. looked at him with an embarrassed smile and said that they both wanted it. Servant guiltily said that it was all his fault, and he felt guilty. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that she was okay. She said that she understood everything and asked him to stop behaving like that. Adelia, with a smile, said that she had a frail body. She said that this was not new news for her. She, with a smile, and looked at him and said that they were prescribed more sleep. Adelia looked at her and said that the doctor said that she needed to take medicine right after eating. She looked at him in surprise and asked if she really needed to eat in the middle of the night. He looked at her and said that it was already noon and she had slept all day. The young lady, in turn, was a little embarrassed. She sighed heavily and asked him what was wrong with her people. He sighed heavily and said that unfortunately, her people are now in custody. He said he locked them inside, not outside Yahi, and the knights took away their weapons and magic stones, and everyone treats them humanely. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that it was a very good job. Adelia said that she would definitely call them all later and discuss everything with them. She looked closely at her lover and said that he had enough of sitting on the ground and that he should come up to her. She sighed heavily and said that since this situation had arisen, it would be better for them to let go of those who did not intend to cooperate with them and keep those who agreed to continue to be with them. He looked at her closely and said that among her followers, there were those who were more devoted to her than to Aeolus. He sighed heavily and said that there were many such. He understood perfectly well that they were very dangerous for the young lady. He could not allow them to be near the young lady at all. He wanted to put magical shackles on them so that his lady would not be in any danger. He sighed heavily, as he knew that the young lady would not agree to control her people with magic. But he understood that he must definitely do this behind her back. He knew that putting shackles on the request would solve the problems. He understood perfectly well that he couldn't mention this to the young lady. She sighed heavily, and after thinking, said that if there were those who wanted to stay, she would impose restrictions on them. He shuddered at the unexpected proposal. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she was really talking about magical shackles now. He hoped that she had not read his thoughts. The young lady sighed heavily and said that it was all true, since they could not guarantee that there would not be a spy among the people. He looked at her intently, but did not answer. But a moment later, he said that if this situation happened, he would spare no one. The young lady looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. He said that no one would ever dare to hand it over. She looked at him intently, with a smile on her face, as she was very glad that he was telling her such words. She said with a smile that she was very grateful to him, but still now she wanted to put this situation off. But later, she said with a smile that there was something she wanted to hear from him now. The young lady looked at her lover and said that he should try calling her by another name. Adelia herself shortened her name. He froze in embarrassment and shock. She looked at him with a smile and said that he should address her exactly like that. Servan froze, not knowing what to answer, as he was very embarrassed. Some time later, he finally overcame himself and shyly called her affectionately by her nickname. He looked at her in bewilderment. The young league froze from his beauty, since he was very shy. Adelia looked in surprise at her chopped hair and asked when he would get used to it. She asked if she should really punish him from now on for every word the lady said. A moment later, they heard a knock on the door and froze in place. The young lady Z froze in place and wondered who had come to her. She did not know whether her people had come or whether they were looking for Servan. But a moment later, the knight called the commander. The young lady in turn watched closely the young men who had begun an important conversation. She looked closely at the young man and wondered who he was. She thought about it as she remembered that she had seen his face before his rebirth. He always looked at her with caution. She looked at him intently, not looking away as she remembered his name. The young man looked at her in surprise as he felt her gaze on him. A moment later, he looked at her with a smile and said that it was a great honor for him to meet her. He slowly walked closer to her and said that he was the commander's advisor, and his name was Yugal. Servan called his advisor very loudly. He was shocked by the advisor's courtesies to his lady. Yugal looked at the commander with bewilderment, since he himself had previously told him to be polite to the young lady. He looked at the commander and asked why he had become so angry. The advisor looked closely at the commander and asked if the words that came out of his mouth upset him. He did not understand why the commander was so worried. Servan looked at his advisor with fury and told him to leave quickly. Adelia looked closely at her lover and told him to calm down. She was a little surprised, as she did not expect him to have an advisor. Yugal thought for a moment and said that his commander was truly a great man, so he did not really need his help. But at times the commander's judgment was extremely wrong. Jugelm looked hard at the commander and said that it seemed like it was an obstacle, and he just wanted to avoid it. The young lady thought for a moment and said that the commander must have been in trouble because of her. She looked closely at the young men and said that it seemed that on this cold winter day, he did not allow the soldiers to enter the castle. The young man was surprised and did not understand how she found out about this. She said that castles were too quiet, so it was not difficult for her to guess. She looked at them sideways and said that she could not let the soldiers freeze to death. She said that they could enter the village, and she would also allow them to enter the castle. Servan looked at the young lady in surprise. She handed him the document with a smile and did not tell him to read it. Adelia handed him a schematic diagram showing thousands of tents strong enough to withstand a snowstorm, and also the locations with the necessary medical equipment. She looked at her lover with a smile and said that she was giving it all to him. The young man looked at the young lady in surprise. He wondered how she was able to prepare all this. He knew very well that she was very smart. He wondered if all this was done under her guidance. The young lady, in turn, was very pleased with the way she prepared for this day. Yugam looked at the commander intently and said that he should be ashamed of himself for creating difficulties for the young lady. The young lady, in turn, laughed. She walked up to her lover and hugged him by the hand. She looked at the assistant and said that she was older than him. The young man froze in shock because he didn't believe what she said. She looked at him intently and asked if he had forgotten her words. She said that he should not call her lady. She asked if he wanted to be punished. Adelia looked intently at her lover and said that he should call her by name, and then she would allow him to kiss her. He began to pronounce her name with embarrassment. She said with a smile that she allowed him to do it. A moment later, he hovered over her and said her name tenderly. He slowly reached out to her and kissed her tenderly. Adelia froze in place as she felt someone's presence. The maid looked closely at the young people and said that she came to them because she was told that she was hungry, and she even knocked. She sighed heavily and said that she would definitely return a little later. She looked at them closely and said that by the time she returned, she hoped they would have come to their senses. The young lady, in turn, looked at her lover with a smile on her face. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really liked this maid. She thought for a moment and said that she didn't know. She knew perfectly well that this maid was very good. Her name is Jessie, and before her reincarnation, Servan sent a maid to her. Adelia was beside herself because she was clinging to Servan, even though she wasn't even Gerard's person, and Adelia herself was unkind to her. But now she understood that the maid was sent to her in order to protect her. Adelia saw that Jessie had wounds on her hands, and there were many of them, even more than the other maids. The young lady said with a smile that the maid had many scars on her hands and that it was very suspicious. He looked at her closely and said that there is always the possibility of being killed during a war. But the truth is that the maid is the most talented person he keeps here. He was surprised because he did not think that the young lady would notice this so soon. He looked at her intently and said that if she did not like the maid, then he would tell her to keep a low profile as much as possible. Adelia looked at him intently and said that there was no need for that. He slowly began to feed the young lady. She said with a smile that it reminded her of her childhood, since he always fed her soup when she was sick. She asked with a smile when they managed to grow up so much. A moment later, she looked at him with a contented smile and said that she loved him very much. Servant looked at the loving union with embarrassment and said with a smile that he also loved her very much, and he also called her by her nickname. The young lady, in turn, understood perfectly well that in the past he had died precisely because of her. She knew that he saved her from death, and he himself died from poisoning. The prince who had the antidote at that time wanted the young man to drink the poison in exchange for the medicine. Unfortunately, she did not know the details of the deal between the two of them. She heard that he took poison, and after that, her illness went away. She understood now that she needed to understand where she was poisoned. She knew that at that time, even a cup of tea passed through his hands. She wondered if it was possible that the cause was not food. She wondered what it could be. She was very worried, as this incident did not give her peace. He looked at the young lady intently, and a moment later leaned in to kiss her. The young lady looked at him in surprise and said with a smile that he usually doesn't do this first. She said with a smile that he can try to do this more often from me, since she really likes it. He looked at her intently and asked if he could do it. She said with a smile that of course he could. She looked at him intently with a smile and said that they were now lovers. He was surprised since it had not been long since she had said pleasant words to him, and it reminded him of their childhood. He looked at her intently and said that if she continued crying, her temperature would rise. She shouted that he was very noisy, and also asked who told him to say this. Servan knew that no matter how ill she was, it was difficult for the Count, who was in foreign lands, to immediately return home. At such moments, she always cried to him, and he was very glad to listen to her grumbling. He thought for a moment, as it seemed to him, that it was yesterday when they were both children. She was surprised, looked at him, and asked what was wrong with him, as he now looked like his parent. Servan was taken aback and shuddered. But a moment later, he came to his senses, and looking at the young lady, said that he needed to communicate some ideas. He said that he had prepared 2 types of medicine for her. He looked at her intently, and said with embarrassment that one medicine was for a cold. He timidly began to talk about the second medicine. Adelia looked at him with bewilderment, as she did not understand what he was talking about. But a moment later, she finally understood what he wanted to tell her. She looked at him with a smile and said that children are the greatest blessings for parents, and she would be very happy if it came from below for them. She smiled and said that their children would be wonderful. She looked at him intently and asked if they would not be the greatest joy for them. Servan froze in surprise and said with a smile that it was exactly so. He sat down next to her and exhaled heavily. She looked at him in surprise, as he was a little excited. He sheepishly said that he had chosen the medicine with the fewest side effects, but was still worried that the medicine would harm her health. She smiled and said that she was not sick or anything like that, so he didn't need to worry. She said she felt a little sleepy, and that was all. She said she would sleep a little and go meet some people later. He looked at her closely and asked if she wanted him to deal with it. Adelia said there was no need for that, as these were her people, and she should do it. A moment later, she fell asleep. Servan looked intently at the young lady, and memories of 4 years ago came flooding back to him. The Count looked intently at the young man and told him to leave. He looked at the Count in surprise and asked if he could find out the reason. The Count looked at the young man intently and said that his abilities were not sufficient. The Count understood perfectly well that he was a simple chick that had not yet hatched from the egg, and now this was beyond his strength. He knew that excessive force only brings destruction. Servant looked intently at the Count and asked if he knew what he was. Graft sighed heavily and said that sometimes in life they are overtaken by terrible shocks, and then the moment comes when they have to choose. He said that the outcome of the choice could be the abyss or the paradise that they all so longed for. He looked closely at the young man and said that right now they were standing at a crossroads. Servant looked at the Count in surprise and asked if he had really just said that they were standing at a crossroads together. He looked at the Count intently and said that perhaps he knew what he was. The Count sighed heavily and said that knowing that he was like this, he did not feel any joy at all. Servan looked intently at the Count and said that his words could be understood, since he himself was afraid of his own existence. He sighed heavily and said that something that should not have been laid down had found its breath. Servan asked the Count if this could not be terrifying. The Count looked intently at the young man, but said nothing. A moment later, he walked slowly up to him and said with a smile that knowing what he was made him feel relieved. Servan Z was shocked, as he did not expect this from the Count. Then he thought that the Count was very strange. He looked intently at the Count, for he understood that he was the same as the young lady. Servan understood perfectly well that they were both unusual. He sighed heavily and told the Count that he was contradictory. The Count looked intently at the young man and told him to come over for a minute. He slowly took the young man's hand and said with a smile that his hands were already bigger than his. The Count looked at him intently and asked if he was really only 18 years old. Servan was in shock and did not understand what was going on. The Count looked at the young man closely and said that one day his hands would have to take care of everything. Graf said that he did not want to give up, but unfortunately, there was nothing he could do about it. Then the Count told the young man that he didn't need to worry at all. Servant was very worried and did not really understand the Count's words. He looked closely at the young lady and wondered if the Count's words spoken so many years ago had anything to do with her safety. He didn't think it was a lie at all. He checked everything last night, and luckily there is no trace of magic or curses on her body. Just in case, he even asked the doctor if she had been poisoned, but her blood turned out to be clean. The knight called the commander and said that unfortunately they had problems. Adelia woke up late at night and in a delirium called for her lover. Unfortunately, she did not even have the strength to get up. The maid looked at the young lady and said that the commander was not here. The young lady looked at the maid in surprise and asked how she should address her. The maid looked closely at the young lady and said that her name was Jessie. Jessie said, "Young lady, it was time for the procedures." But unfortunately, the young lady did not wake up, and so she came to her. Adelia looked intently at the maid and asked if she knew where the commander was now. Jessie looked at her intently and said that it was obvious that he was in the middle of a war. Adelia stood frozen in a daze. She was shocked that the commander had gone to battle. She sighed heavily and said that she understood everything. The maid looked at the lady intently and asked if she knew the commander had never been mortally wounded. She said that of course it was a battle he could not avoid minor injuries. Jessie said that at least there was never a situation where he was between life and death. She said that she never saw him naked, but she was sure that the young lady knew about it. She told the young lady that she was worried about him in her mind, because no matter how stingy the commander was with his emotions, he would not like to see her like this now. She looked closely at the young lady and said that the commander protected her more than anything in the world. The young lady in turn knew this very well, since in his past life he drank poison and died instantly. But she remained alive since she did not know what kind of poison it was, and how she was poisoned by it. She knew that she would have to resolve this issue. She understood perfectly well that if she sat still and was nervous, it would not change anything. She understood that she had to do everything possible before his return. The young lady looked closely at the maid and did not tell her to call the culprits. She said she would like to know their opinion. Some time later, the young lady stood tall above the crowd of people who had previously worked at the estate. Standing before them, the young lady used her magic. She looked intently at everyone present and said that she denied that the land where she was born and raised belonged to Airless. Adelia said that Gerard belongs to Elaine. Everyone present was shocked, as they did not expect to hear such a thing. The man looked at her with fury and asked how she could betray her own country. Adelia looked at everyone present and said that she was not forcing them at all. She just wanted to give them the right to choose. She said that she was the Count's daughter and wanted to ask them. She looked at everyone present and asked if they were choosing Airless or Gerard. She stood in pitch silence, waiting for their answer. She knew perfectly well that if they united, it would help, but if they left, there would be no particular harm to them either. But still, she knew that she would be a little annoyed. She had no intention of seducing them with her speeches. Her supporters who support her, the knights, slowly approached the young lady and said that they were about the Lord's gun, and knights do not ask which way the Lord chooses. They said that, for this reason, their way is hers. They said that they were born and raised in the estate, and their oath belonged to her. The knights looked at the young lady and said that they would certainly follow her. She looked at everyone present and said that those who agreed to stay with her would be strictly monitored. She said that she would test their loyalty. She looked at those present and asked if, despite this, they still wanted to be her people. They looked at her intently and said that they would think they deserved it. Adelia looked at the knights and said that they were chosen. She said that she could not at all say that they would not regret their choice, but at least she would do everything possible. She looked at everyone present and said that he would not pursue them if they returned back to Airless. The young lady thanked everyone for their hard work and said that she would also raise funds for their accommodation. She said with a smile that she was not forcing any of them. The maid looked closely at the young lady and asked if she was upset. Adelia thought for a moment and said that she didn't even know. She said that unfortunately, he couldn't say that she wasn't upset, because she had made a lot of mistakes. She said she should be kind to those who remained. Jessie said she was very interested in whether the others would join. The young lady suddenly felt awkward and did not know what to answer. But a moment later, she looked at the maid with a smile on her face. The young lady looked at us with a smile on her face and said that she had become her exclusive maid. Adelia tenderly kissed the maid's hand and asked her to be her person, not Servan's. Jessie froze in shock, wondering if she had been bewitched. The young lady thought for a moment. She said that she might have caused the commander serious problems since she allowed them to leave. Jessie said that he would not get into trouble. Because of that, he was a reliable person. The young lady was surprised, looked at the maid, and asked if she was really serious now. Jessie looked at the young lady intently and said that she was. Jerry said that His Highness has great confidence in Servan, so she thinks so herself. Jessie said that the commander was a very insightful man, and although he left in a hurry today, he prepared diligently. The young lady looked at the maid with a smile and asked if he always prepared so carefully for everything. The maid, in turn, was very worried, since she could not control her facial expression, and the sparks from it, her emotions when someone touched her. She did not understand what she felt. She looked at the young lady closely and said that she might get sick and moved the shawl over her shoulder. The young lady thanked the maid. Adelia said that she really wants Servan V to return to her as soon as possible. Jessie froze for a moment, as it was a very touching wish. She sighed heavily, as she knew she had never been like this. The maid looked at the young lady and said that it was already late, and also wished her good night. The young lady, in turn, also wished the maid good night. As soon as the maid left, the young lady rushed to the writing desk. She slowly took the documents to read them. She looked closely at the contents of the documents. She wondered if she should go on the trip. The young man ran up to the commander and called him. The commander, in turn, told his subordinate not to fuss. Servan looked at the assistant intently and said that he came here alone. The young man was shocked. He did not understand how the commander could tell him not to worry. He looked at the commander intently and asked how he could be so indifferent. He was worried because his commander was wandering alone during the war. Servan sighed heavily and said that it was not that far. He said he would be there in a few hours and ran away in the blink of an eye. The young man was in shock. He shouted to the commander that it was very presumptuous of him. The maid approached the young man and told him to calm down. She asked him if he had ever fallen head over heels in love. The young man, in turn, was breathing heavily, as he was very frightened by Jessie's unexpected appearance. He sighed heavily and said that, actually, being a deputy commander would not be easy. She looked at him intently and said that if he had nothing better to do, he could leave. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She sighed heavily and said that she would only have to take care of his stupid clothes. The young man looked at her timidly and said that she still worked very hard. She knew it better than anyone. She knew that she had to try to get what she didn't have. She looked after him intently, but said nothing. Servants slowly moved the young lady to bed. When he entered the room, he saw that she had fallen asleep at the desk.